Thank you. The next item of business is a debate on motion 20964 in the name of Edward Mountain on the draft climate change plan on behalf of the Net Zero, Energy and Transport Committee. I would invite those members who would wish to speak in the debate. Please press the request to speak buttons and I call on Edward Mountain to speak to and to move the motion on behalf of the Net Zero, Energy and Transport Committee. Up to 9 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And helpfully, my office has written on the start of this speech, farmer, which I wrote not yet, but I am going to remind members of my register of interest that I do have a farm in Murray, and I do that because we're going to be talking about agriculture. Thank you, Presiding Officer, for giving me the opportunity to speak to this. I'm pleased to speak on behalf of the Net Zero, Energy and Transport Committee. First of all, I'd like to thank committee colleagues and also the clerks for their work not only in scrutinising the draft plan but producing our report over a fairly hectic 3 days. As I'll touch on later, the process has been frustrating in my mind and slightly unedifying, but I am content that we as a committee have played our part well. The committee held 9 evidence sessions, a call for views and a targeted online consultation. We met with young people and we got out and about visiting Aberdeen. And I would like to thank all of those people that engaged with the committee during this process. As lead committee, we proposed dividing up the work on the draft plan, and I'd like to thank all the other committees for their efforts to ensure that this was a cross-committee effort. Including our own, there are now 4 committee reports on the draft plan, and 6 other committees sent letters to support our work. The 2024 Act followed advice from the Climate Change Committee that the targets to reduce emissions by 75% by 2030 was no longer achievable. The Act moved to a system of 5-year carbon budgets, replacing annual targets, and moved the date back when a plan was required. The draft plan in front of us is the first under the changes made by the 2024 Act, and indeed the first statutory draft plan since the 2019 Climate Act. After the end of the parliamentary scrutiny period today, the Scottish Government must lay a final climate change plan, reflecting on the views that they've heard. Now, the Cabinet Secretary has said, Presiding Officer, it is her intention to do so before dissolution in just a few weeks. But legally, Presiding Officer, that doesn't have to be done within that timeframe. As a committee, we acknowledge that there have been good progress overall, with emissions more than halved since 1990. However, recently momentum has been lost, and we heard that more challenging actions will now need to be required across more sectors. We agree that the delivery must be the central focus of the final plan, but we found the draft falls somewhat shorter as a delivery-focused document. The plan should clearly set out how the government will use its powers to drive down emissions. Where they do not have powers, they should be clearer about that. We found 4 areas where the government should consider, Presiding Officer. First, we recognise that all climate policy is underpinned by modelling, which intrinsically is uncertain. However, we heard that the information provided on emissions, costs, and I stress particularly on costs and benefit, does not give the detail needed to scrutinise the government's assumptions. The government should welcome informed and constructive criticism of the data and assumptions they have used, and the final plan should provide more of this. On costs and benefits modelling specifically, we accepted that it would be challenging to set out where and on whom costs will fall. But we also asked the government to reflect on whether the draft falls short as a signal to the public and stakeholders on what costs and incentives there are, and indeed who will have to pay. Secondly, we discussed the approach to the monitoring in the draft plan, which includes a proposal for early warning indicators to account for the fact that accurate emissions data comes with a delay. However, the draft doesn't include what these indicators will be. We recommend that these should be published at the earliest opportunity to ensure that the corrective action could be taken when required. They should also be performance indicators with a clear link to the corresponding policies that are published within the plan. Thirdly, we noted that delivering changes throughout the economy is a complex task. It needs coordinated action across the breadth of government and with multiple partners over long periods of time. We discussed dependencies on UK government action, particularly on electricity, where lower electricity costs would help, and are desperately needed in several areas to decarbonise at the pace that is being asked. We also noted the critical role for local government, which I'm sure the Local Government Committee's convener will touch upon in her contribution. We also heard evidence of the support communities and individual need and the role they could play in reducing emissions. While we welcomed the reopening of the Climate Engagement Fund, we recommended that the Scottish Government should communicate clearly what the plan means to people's everyday lives, working with communities and others to do this. Now, the agriculture, land use, buildings and industry sectors were also considered by the Rural, Local Government and Economy Committees, respectively, and we agreed wholeheartedly with their conclusions and recommendations. Presiding Officer, I'm going to briefly touch on three sectors we considered. On energy, we discussed the reliance of the draft plan on negative emission technologies and asked the government to set out how they would monitor if these technologies were on track to come online in time to meet their ambitions. The committee considers the plan relies in a large part on electrification, without laying out how electricity costs will be reduced, which is absolutely vital. However, we found it to be insufficient in setting out how the government proposes it will meet the substantial increase in renewable energy required to electrify key technologies, especially so in the absence of an updated energy strategy. On transport, we noted it places significant reliance on the uptake of electric vehicles. This is a considerable move away from the 2020 Climate Change Plan update, which committed to an ambitious target to reduce car mileage by 20% by 2030. The draft plan now only proposes a 4% reduction. We heard particularly concerning evidence from industry that plans to electrify heavy good vehicles were totally unrealistic. The industry instead suggested that a role for drop-in biofuels was more appropriate, which we've asked the government to explore. And on waste, Presiding Officer, the committee was concerned that projections for energy from waste emissions might be underestimates following the decision to delay the enforcement of the ban on biodegradable municipal waste going to landfill shortly before the plan was submitted. The thread throughout the plan is that the just transition, including the welcome addition of just transition indicators. The Economy Committee led this work. However, we also heard evidence on it. We recommend the Scottish and UK governments work together on site-specific just transition plans where they are needed. Now, I want to finish, Presiding Officer, on the process for developing the climate change plan. The Parliament, regretfully, is in the same place as it was 5 years ago. We are doing this work right at the end of the parliamentary session, something I counselled against as convener when we started down this process. Now, while this has been extremely challenging for committees, it's not the primary concern. The key issue is that the Scottish Government have only 3 weeks, if the Cabinet Secretary is to meet her own deadlines, to finalise this plan to meet their timetable. This, to me, is bad practice because it lowers confidence in what should be a robust process. Because what we have to remember is that the government will have to consider the committee's reports, all of the committee's reports, the consultations that have been covered out with the public, and implement that into the final plan. Presiding Officer, I look forward to hearing the views of members on whether the wait was worth it and whether this draft climate plan can be turned into a climate change plan in the next few weeks, and we get that delivery back on track. Presiding Officer, I have, during this process, by the process alone, been underwhelmed and deeply sceptical of the way the Parliament has dealt with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Minor. Could I ask you to move the motion, please?
It did say that at the end, to move the motion. I didn't read my own notes. I apologise. I moved the motion in my name.
Thank you very much, Mr Mountain. And I now call on Claire Hockey on behalf of the Health, Social Care and Sport Committee to open up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, for the opportunity to contribute to this debate on behalf of the Health, Social Care and Sport Committee. First and foremost, I'd like to offer a sincere thanks to all stakeholders who engaged throughout the Health Committee scrutiny of the draft Climate Change Plan. And as this is likely the last time I'll speak in Chamber as convener of the Health, Social Care and Sport Committee in this session, I would like to put on record my thanks to the committee clerks. Given the scope of the plan and its cross-cutting nature as it relates to health outcomes, it was paramount that we were able to draw upon a solid evidence base. And I'm pleased to say the level of oral and written evidence received has allowed us to produce what I believe to be a comprehensive report as relates to the health remit. I would also like to thank the Net Zero Committee, particularly for the innovative approach to the scrutiny, which has enabled contributions from across portfolios. The need for greater cross-committee working is something this Chamber has spoken about at length, and I'm grateful to all committees who have taken the time to contribute to the overall scrutiny of the plan. And I look forward to seeing more scrutiny work done on this basis and commend the example that has been set across the Chamber and committees. Turning now to the Health Committee's report, the Chamber will be aware that as part of its scrutiny, the committee held 3 evidence sessions with a focus on the potential co-benefits for health on emissions reduction and potential impact of the draft plan on health and social care services. Members will be aware that the draft plan is presented as being necessitated by and having the purposes of addressing the health risks associated with climate change. Indeed, under the Climate Change Scotland Act 2009, as amended, the plan must set out policies and proposals for reducing greenhouse gas emissions across all major sectors of the economy. Although health and social care is not one of the sectors required to be covered, some elements of health and social care emissions will be nested within the sector's residential and public buildings and transport, which are required by the legislation. I would also remind members that the Population Health Framework, published in June 2025, stated that a just transition to net zero is among Public Health Scotland's commitments in supporting health and well-being. In this context, the committee welcomes evidence that a growing number of health boards are implementing sustainable travel schemes for patients and staff and encourages further sharing of best practice in this area. The committee also notes that health boards should maintain momentum in collaborating with other authorities and providers to ensure that large hospitals are treated as sustainable, connected transport hubs for people attending appointments as well as visitors. The draft CCP also identifies a number of health benefits from policies and proposals to reduce emissions in other sectors, including cleaner air, warmer homes, healthier food, health-promoting natural and built environments, and high-quality public services and fair work. Indeed, one of the core themes from both oral and written evidence was the significant health impacts associated with emissions and the scale of potential co-benefits from mitigation. However, the committee heard from both witnesses and respondents that health and inequality outcomes should be made explicit in the plan and that these co-benefits should be integral to policy appraisal and budget decisions rather than treated as secondary considerations. The CCP cuts across the building blocks of health and should be more explicitly treated as a public health intervention in the plan. The committee also echoes calls from Public Health Scotland for a health in all policies approach in which climate measures are designed and delivered to reduce emissions while maximising health gains, thereby contributing to improved life expectancy and reducing health inequalities. The disproportionate effects of climate change on disabled people, those with long-term conditions, unpaid carers and lower-income households has long been established. And in this context, the committee would highlight the importance of designing mitigation measures to avoid widening existing health inequalities. And it's also vital that the role of social care is recognised within this wider prevention agenda. The issue of air quality and impact of certain pollutants was also raised extensively in evidence, and the committee echoes calls from witnesses for improved monitoring frameworks and action in these areas. Any changes to monitoring should track both indoor and outdoor air quality outcomes to ensure that the improvements in buildings and transport deliver, rather than risk undermining health and well-being. More specifically, the committee notes that the lack of quantifiable metrics in this area and that this could lead to difficulties in tracking delivery and outcomes. We would therefore call for clear indicators of health, well-being and equity impacts alongside emission outcomes, reflective of place-based variation and embedded public health expertise in the design and interpretation of these metrics, so that co-benefits and risks are properly captured and used to inform appraisal and budget decisions. Finally, the committee notes that the complex role of food in meeting climate and health objectives. While I am conscious of the fact that this is not explicitly explored in the plan, the Health Committee nevertheless highlights concerns raised in the report on the proposed National Good Food Nation plan about the risks of taking a siloed approach, and reiterates its call for the Scottish Government to set out more clearly how it will work to foster improved cross-sector and cross-portfolio collaboration to further strengthen the NHS and wider approaches to sustainable procurement and minimisation of food waste. To conclude, Presiding Officer, it's clear that the draft climate change plan is incredibly broad in scope, and the committee commends the plan insofar as it recognises the health benefits associated with reducing climate emissions and other policies mentioned across sectors. However, more can be done to make these links more explicit, and I hope future members in this chamber are able to continue the level of cross-portfolio working throughout this scrutiny process to ensure the final plan is delivering on all its intended outcomes.
Thank you, Ms Hockey. I now call on Ariane Burgess on behalf of the Local Government Housing and Planning Committee. Up to 6 minutes, please.
I'm pleased, Presiding Officer, to contribute to today's important debate on behalf of the Local Government Housing and Planning Committee. We examined the buildings element of the climate change plan and the role that local authorities have in delivering the plan's ambitions. Buildings are the fourth largest emitter of carbon in Scotland. Decarbonising how we heat our homes and other buildings is one of the critical actions we have to take if Scotland is going to meet its net zero target. In practical terms, there needs to be a huge shift away from gas heating to technology like heat pumps. And sadly, we heard from stakeholders their frustrations that there's been a lost decade where it was clear what actions could make a difference, but rather than being able to get on and deliver those, instead we've been mired in lengthy planning and strategising. As a result, people lack confidence that this plan can deliver. Back in 2023, the Scottish Government announced it would deliver a sea change through a heat in buildings bill that would legislate during this session of Parliament for the installation of heat pumps in our homes. And that legislation never arrived. Instead, the Government has published a draft bill, one that some would say has greatly altered the original vision for decarbonising homes. And I highlight this because one of the committee's key concerns is we know that at the moment, very few homes use a heat pump. There were only around 7,000 installed in 2024. In stark contrast, Nesta Scotland estimated that around 110,000 heat pumps will need to be installed during the course of the next Parliament, and that's 22,000 a year. The climate change plan does not set out how that dramatic change will take place. It does, though, commit to a new heat and building strategy and delivery plan to be published this year, and I hope that will prove to be that driver for change. But in the meantime, the Climate Change Committee's report on Scotland's progress in reducing emissions agrees with our conclusion that fundamentally the draft CCP lacks sufficient detailed plans for buildings. In particular, there will need to be a rapid acceleration in 10 years' time in reducing emissions, but it's not clear yet how that will happen. And the CCC's report describes this as a delay and catch-up approach, which carries significant risk. It says a more plausible approach would be to scale up a steady increase in heat pump installation, and my committee concluded that there are some critical components required to help deliver that. Firstly, a national retrofitting plan is needed, which sets out how we're going to go about making our homes more energy efficient. Tenement buildings are a real challenge, which are around 30% of our urban housing stock, and also our rural properties, which are typically older and colder. The first step is ensuring we have enough people trained in the right skills to deliver. A skills plan must be a component of that wider retrofitting plan and include traditional building skills. Building in the right skills for Scotland's varied housing stock presents a huge economic opportunity, but it's not going to happen without leadership. We also need to build the demand for decarbonising homes. People need to want to have technology like heat pumps installed, and it needs to be made possible and easy for them. They need to know where to go for that trusted advice and for help with planning what they're going to spend money on. And the committee recommends the government supports the creation of one-stop shops that can provide that kind of support. Home Energy Scotland provides an important service. It's difficult to see, though, how it will be able to meet future demand, in particular for more tailored advice. There's also the need for an updated public engagement strategy. This needs to cover how consumers are going to be informed about what they can do, why they should be doing it, and where they can go for the help and financial support. Turning to the role of local authorities, they are key in the delivery of the climate change plan, and it's clear that they recognise the urgency, and when they came to committee, it was also clear that they are ready to act. They told the committee, though, that they need a route map for how to achieve that. They also told the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee the same thing in 2023, which resulted in a recommendation to the Scottish Government to do just that. The draft CCP hasn't taken that on board, and we therefore recommend that the final version of the plan gives local authorities clarity, setting out the role they have in delivering each policy and proposal in the plan. Currently, it's difficult to see how local authorities will be able to identify sufficient resources to deliver the ambitions in the plan. And the committee therefore also calls on the Scottish Government to explore what additional resource and long-term certainty it can provide through multi-year funding. In conclusion, Convener, we hope that the Scottish Government takes account of the committee's recommendations and that the final version of the climate change plan provides that clarity and leadership that is needed. Without that, I fear that Scotland's important net zero ambitions may be at risk.
Thank you, Ms Burgess. I now call on Finlay Carson to open on behalf of the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to be able to speak today on behalf of the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee to set out the findings of our scrutiny of the agriculture and land use chapters of the draft climate change plan. The committee began our scrutiny work by taking oral evidence at meetings in early January. We heard from a range of stakeholders, including academics and NGOs with experience and expertise in agriculture, peatlands and forestry, as well as representatives of the agriculture and forestry sectors. We then took concluding evidence from the Cabinet Secretary and our officials later that month. On behalf of the committee, let me take this opportunity to thank everyone who contributed to our scrutiny of the draft CCP and to the clerks involved in the preparation. Turning first to our findings on the agriculture chapter, the Scottish Government has set out in the draft CCP that it intends to achieve most of its reductions in agricultural emissions through its reforms to support payments. Many stakeholders agreed that changes to the requirements for agricultural subsidies would help to incentivise farmers to transition to more sustainable and climate-friendly practices. However, the committee also heard concerns from the industry that there remained a lack of clarity around the Scottish Government's reform programme, which they believe was holding back efforts to decarbonise the sector in the short term. The sector was particularly concerned by delays to the first rural support plan, which will set out the Scottish Government's policy priorities for agriculture support over the next 5 years. I will.
Sarah Boyd.
Can I thank the member for raising that issue, because that issue is raised with myself as well. If we're going to get the agriculture sector to be able to make the transition that's needed, don't they need long-term support schemes that will actually help fund innovative farming, but also change farming practices to give them the support they need now as our climate begins to change?
Finlay Carson.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. There is sadly very little policy to come in front of the Parliament, other than legislation that ensures continuity of the Common Agricultural Policy. So it is something that we believe that creates a huge amount of uncertainty in how farming is actually going to deliver. The delay to the support plan, as we've said, has hampered the committee's ability to scrutinise the draft CCP, meaning that we could not come to a view on the emissions reduction pathway being proposed in the agriculture chapter, because we simply do not have all the information that we need. The only option open to us has been to recommend that our successor committee examines the linkages between the Rural Support Plan, the final CCP and the wider agriculture reform programme in the next parliamentary session, to ensure that they show sufficient leadership and ambition for the agriculture sector. The committee also considered the Scottish Government's announcement not to reduce livestock numbers in order to reduce agricultural emissions. We had a range of views on this decision, with those in support pointing to the economic cost of a declining livestock sector in Scotland, as well as the potential for this to lead to an offshoring of livestock emissions to other countries in order to meet domestic demand. However, given that almost half of agriculture emissions in Scotland come from livestock production, some stakeholders did question whether the Scottish Government could deliver its climate ambitions without dealing with the sector's highest emitter. In weighing up both arguments, the committee believes that what is important is ensuring that any shortfalls in emissions from not reducing livestock numbers are being compensated for through deeper reductions in other sectors. And we tasked the Net Zero Committee to consider this as part of its wider consideration of the draft plan. Turning to the land use chapter of the plan, the main policy commitments made by the Scottish Government to reduce emissions from the introduction of new targets to restore more than 400,000 hectares of degraded peatland by 2040 and to increase annual tree planting to 18,000 hectares by 2030. The committee heard strong support for the new targets on the basis they demonstrate a clear commitment by the Government to develop these sectors over the long term. While some stakeholders questioned whether these targets were achievable, those involved in delivering peatland restoration and forest projects made clear that they were ready to scale up their operation in order to meet the ambitions set out in the draft CCP. But they also told us that the Government must play its part in providing certainty around public funding to give businesses the confidence to invest in the workforce and equipment needed to ramp up capacity. The committee believes that the final CCP provides an opportunity for the Scottish Government to clearly set out how it will finance tree planting and peatland restoration over the longer term to give the private sector this much needed clarity. The committee has also recommended the final CCP should include details of how peatland restoration and tree planting activities will be prioritised. This follows evidence we heard from academics which emphasise that the Scottish Government must ensure peatland restoration and tree planting activities take account of the individual characteristics of the sites. These must ensure the right tree was in the right place and that the most highly degraded peatlands are tackled rather than activities focusing on less degraded or more easily restored sites. To conclude, Presiding Officer, I think it's fair to say that the draft climate change plan has left the committee with more questions than answers. We expect to see the Scottish Government make improvements to both chapters in the final CCP to provide further clarity around how emissions reduction pathways for agriculture and land use will be delivered in practice. I hope, therefore, that the Scottish Government engages constructively with the findings of our report, which seeks to identify some of these gaps in order for them to be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Carson. And I now call on Claire Adamson to open on behalf of the Constitution, Europe, External Affairs and Culture Committee. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Excuse me. Thank you, Presiding Officer. As part of our pre-budget scrutiny in 26-27, the Constitution, Europe, External Affairs and Culture Committee considered the role of the culture sector in addressing climate change and reaching net zero. Excuse me, Presiding Officer. Apologies. Our findings and recommendations were set out in our pre-budget report and in our letter to Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee, the latter of which has been included in this report on the draft climate change plan. If I could just say that members of the committee and I attended the Museums and Galleries Symposium this week, albeit for parliamentary hustings. However, it was noted that some of the issues that face the culture sector due to lack of funding, capital investment and the rising cost of fuel and energy are probably only going to be exacerbated by current global events, which is likely to put further pressure on the sector going forward. I thank the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee for their work on this, and I welcome the opportunity to take part today. During our evidence-taking, we heard that organisations from across the culture sector are implementing a wide range of measures to reduce emissions and contribute to net zero ambitions. Some of the measures highlighted include energy efficiency upgrades, circular economy initiatives and carbon budgeting and reporting, to name just a few of those initiatives. We have heard that the culture and heritage sector plays a significant role in shaping public attitudes. For example, the Waters Rising exhibition at Perth Museum was highlighted for its work in engaging the audiences with climate themes. We also heard that projects such as that SNO's Sounds of the Deep Schools initiative were demonstrating how the sector can help foster climate literacy and dialogues in the country. Culture for Climate Scotland told us that cultural organisations, quote, reach the hard-to-reach groups and facilitate creative and accessible restorative ways of talking about climate change. The committee recognises the role of the culture sector in shaping this understanding. We recommend that this role should be recognised in the Scottish Government's climate change plan, and perhaps that further initiatives could be given some support from the Government. Culture and for Climate Scotland also highlighted concerns that funds being mobilised to address climate change may not currently be used to full advantage in the culture sector. We recommended consideration to be given to how to funding the support net zero ambitions that could be used to further the impact of the cultural sector on public attitudes. We heard that achieving net zero will require substantial capital investment in the culture sector and the heritage sector going forward. And as I note, this is only going to get more challenging in the next few coming years. Stakeholders told us that retrofitting of historic buildings, upgrading heating systems and improving energy infrastructure are costly and complex, particularly for listed or heritage properties. The National Museums of Scotland highlighted challenges around sourcing alternative carbon-free heating for sites currently heated by gas boilers. This, they explained, is not only technologically challenging, but also expensive and beyond the annual operating budgets of most museums or heritage buildings. They stated that this level of change will only be possible through partnership working and examining working major external funds in this area. We asked that the Scottish Government outline how it will address the substantial capital investment required if the culture and heritage sectors are to meet the climate change and net zero ambitions. We also heard that audience travel to and from events and venues is still the single largest source of emissions associated with the culture sector. Stakeholders suggested that this may therefore be a useful area to focus on to maximise the impact of spend on reducing the sector's climate impact. And we have heard that the reliance on international visitors, for example, for festivals in Edinburgh, raised difficult questions about international travel in this sector and its impact, if that is not in some way mitigated for. The Cabinet Secretary for Constitution, External Affairs and Culture told us that the Scottish Government is focusing efforts to increase public transport use. He stated that the culture sector should be properly served with its ability for people to travel with the least environmental impact possible. The committee welcomed the confirmation that efforts are being focused on public transport use. However, we also asked that the Scottish Government outline how it's addressing aviation emissions associated with audience travel and festivals. And I look forward to the remaining contributions for the debate today. Thank you very much, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Ms Adamson. I now call on Cabinet Secretary Gillian Martin to open on behalf of the Scottish Government. Up to 8 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to speak in this important debate on the Scottish Government's draft climate change plan. The policies and proposal includes the opportunities it brings for the people of Scotland and the vision for our country's future that it embodies. And I'd first like to thank members from across the Parliament and all the committees for their contributions to the draft plan that we're debating today. I've met with members from across the Chamber over the last few months, and I appreciate the pace at which the committees have acted in scrutinising the draft plan. And I also want to put on record my thanks to my policy team who've worked so hard, and the policy teams of my Cabinet colleagues, particularly those in Transport, Housing and Rural Affairs, who have so much to add to the draft climate change plan and are working very hard to respond to all the committee reports and their recommendations. I'd also like to put on the record my thanks to everyone who has responded to the public consultation and taken part in public engagement events across the country. And this includes almost 2,000 people taking part in over 100 events, and I'm particularly grateful to our partner organisations who are trusted voices within their communities who've delivered these events. While this engagement took place across the whole country, it did focus on the North East, the Forth Valley and Grangemouth and Greater Glasgow and Clyde, all areas with historic connections to fossil fuel industries. This Government is determined to ensure that our communities do not suffer the same fate as former industrial communities did as a result of Thatcher's unjust transition in the 1980s. Presiding Officer, I want to remind colleagues that the first job of Scotland's climate change plan is to set out a credible pathway that will deliver on each of our first 3 carbon budgets and support net zero to net zero by 2045. The Committee for Climate Change have said that we're on an achievable pathway, and very important to me is that the Just Transition Commission also said that the plan is a real step forward. And we have tried very hard to weave just transition throughout every element of the plan. I'm confident that Scotland is on a credible, ambitious and achievable pathway to meet our carbon budgets, but also at the same time to grow our economy and capture the benefits of climate action. It is estimated that there's direct financial benefits of the plan amount to £42.3 billion between 2026 and 2040. The plan will proactively increase our climate resilience also as a nation and reduce our dependence on international markets, which is as important now than ever. But the plan itself will also be reactive and agile to technological changes, to new UK government and international policy moves, and to market shifts. Presiding Officer, this Government believes deeply in a positive vision of the future, and at its heart, this draft plan sets out a future where we're less exposed to fluctuations, particularly in imported fossil fuel prices, and instead benefit from more efficient green technologies which bring with them many opportunities for skilled, low-carbon jobs across the whole country, and indeed a healthier environment for our people to live in. And these jobs are not just speculative. Study after study shows that the impact is already in Scotland and growing. The PwC Green Jobs Barometer shows that green jobs are continuing to grow at a faster rate in Scotland than anywhere else across the UK. And the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit report shows that Scotland's net zero economy has grown by over 21% since 2022. Again, faster than any part of the United Kingdom. And this is a source of great encouragement, and it should be a source of great encouragement to everyone who is involved in the climate change plan and indeed who cares about the impact, the positive benefits included in the climate change plan with regard to economic growth. Data recently published by the ONS shows that Scotland had the largest percentage increase in turnover across our low-carbon and renewable energy sectors compared to anywhere else in the UK. Presiding Officer, the economic opportunities of the transition to a green economy are already here for us to see, and they are growing. But I am clear that climate action set out in our draft plan also crucially brings substantial wider benefits for individuals and our communities. The convener of the Health Committee very helpfully explained some of the health benefits associated with climate action. And I think that here we've got a real opportunity to widen out what's in the final plan to explain more of them. Increased physical activity from the move to active travel will obviously benefit people's health and well-being, as will cleaner air from the switch to electric vehicles and more attractive, sustainable public transport. That's supported by a removal of peak fares on ScotRail, freeze of our rail fares and our £2 bus fare cap pilot, which is now launched in Shetland and the Western Isles. And these changes mean better air quality, having positive impacts on preventing or stopping the exacerbation of lung health conditions. And these will all support reduced pressure on the health service and saving for public finances. And this is an area of work that we're doing in government with academic partners to better identify some of the co-benefits associated with health and what that could mean for future health spend and savings. This is all evidence that in Scotland, emissions reductions, economic and social benefits and economic growth do go hand in hand. Presiding Officer, despite these advances, we must recognise that our Parliament does not possess all the powers necessary to deliver the action we need. We are, regrettably, still reliant on Westminster in some critical areas. When taking evidence in the draft plan, committees have heard repeatedly about the most important issue in the UK government that the UK government must act on, and that is reducing the price of electricity. And I think that has come through in most of the evidence. There's not many things in this area of work that is a silver bullet, but if there is one, it would be bringing down the cost of electricity. For heat pumps to make our homes warmer, for fuel poverty to disappear, for their transport systems to work for everyone, we do need cheaper electricity. We have consistently... Yes?
Sarah Boyd.
I'm certainly going to mention it in my speech, but the issue of solar. Would the Cabinet Secretary talk about where solar fits in and whether she's going to actually have a solar plan that will fit into the final climate change plan?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yeah, well, the solar vision has been worked on in Scotland, where we see what energy mix is going to be available. I would say that in terms of solar, we're looking at all the generators of electricity. There are a couple of things that really have to work to make it attractive for people to be changing their heating systems, for example. That is that more projects need to be able to get onto the grid in order for them to get onto the national grid, so that critical build-out and improvement on the grid system is something that is mentioned by industry time and time again, but also bringing down the costs for households, because at the moment electricity is about 5 times the cost of gas, and that is a significant factor in people not decarbonising, particularly in a cost of living crisis. So we have consistently raised... If I could just move on slightly, and I'm actually over time, so I will just go to the end of my speech. We've consistently raised this issue, and Presiding Officer, we're already getting on with delivery. That's why the Scottish Budget allocated record funding over £5 billion for activities with a positive impact on Scotland's climate change goals. The budget also included new measures to reduce carbon emissions and ensure that the polluter pays, including through a new tax on private jet use. This demonstrates our commitment to deliver a just transition. But I will actually, before I sit down, lead off with one thing. It's not about the costs. It's not just about the costs associated. It's not even just about the cost benefits. I'm going to leave you with the words of Graham Roy, the chair of the Scottish Fiscal Commission, who said, "Not responding to the challenge of climate change will be far more expensive and damaging to the public finances than investing in net zero. It's simply not an option." Thank you.
Thank you. Just to advise the Chamber, there's a bit of time in hand, so certainly any interventions, you'll get the time back and possibly a little bit more. Douglas Lumsden next. A generous 6 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm speaking today with a lot of disappointment, to be honest. What should have been a landmark report for this Parliament is instead a catalogue of errors from this out of time, out of touch SNP devolved government. Now, I've been an MSP for nearly 5 years, and this is one of the most damning reports that I've seen from a committee or have been involved in. The report describes the draft climate action plan in these terms: clear gaps, falls short, insufficient detail, areas of risk, rushed, leading to a lack of confidence from this committee that our concerns will be taken seriously. And rushed, Presiding Officer, is quite a statement to make, given that we were promised this plan over a year ago, and we're so close to the dissolution of this Parliament that it finally appears. Presiding Officer, it's quite simply a disgrace that the Cabinet Secretary can come here today to defend what is in essence a plan without detail, without targets, and will fail to deliver its main point, a reduction in emissions that will contribute to their net climate goals. Any climate change plan should have one aim: to reduce emissions and help us to reach their 2045 climate goals. This plan should be about delivery. It should include timelines and targets for how we will get there. But the plan that the Net Zero Committee were asked to scrutinise does none of this. It has let down our committee, this Parliament and the people of Scotland. I will, of course.
Cabinet Secretary.
What actions, in terms of climate action, would a plan that Douglas Lumsden, as the shadow, put forward to this Parliament that's not in there?
I'll come on to some of the targets that should be in there, because the plan sets out aspirations, which has its place. It's right that the government establishes where it wants to go, what the vision is, and what we have in front of us today is a vision document. I don't feel it's an actual plan. And at committee, time and time again, we asked a simple question: what exactly will be done, by whom, by when, and with what funding? And too often, the answer was not provided. Milestones are particularly weak. They are framed in broad trajectories rather than measurable delivery points. For example, that you were asking for examples, in the decarbonisation of heat in building, the plan sets long-term outcomes for emissions reduction, but does not set clear annual targets for the number of homes to be converted, the workforce that would be required, or the funding profile needed year by year. Without these practical milestones, there is no way for Parliament to track whether delivery is on course or falling behind. I'll take the intervention.
Cabinet Secretary.
So, on heating buildings, what actual plans would the shadow for this portfolio put in a plan that he would devise? How would he decarbonise homes?
Douglas Lumsden.
Any plan should have real proper targets that can be measured. This does not have any of that. You can't wish your way to net zero. If you really want to get into net zero, you are the government, you should put forward a plan. Just like you haven't got an energy strategy, you don't actually have a climate change plan that we can actually look at. Now, and if we don't know how many heat pumps are to be installed each year, how many skilled workers must be trained, or how much capital funding is required at each stage, then we do not have a delivery plan. All we have is an ambition. I will give way.
Stephen Kerr.
We're serious about a plan with detail in it. It wouldn't be cutting colleges the way they've been cutting them for the last 5 years. 20% cuts in real terms. That cuts the availability of skilled workers. And does Douglas Lumsden think it's quite remarkable that the Cabinet Secretary lighted upon the idea that we need to have cheaper electricity, but didn't mention the magic word, nuclear? The country that has the most nuclear power stations in Europe has the cheapest electricity.
Yeah.
Douglas Lumsden.
I completely agree. Once again, they can't wish their way to cheaper electricity, just like the SNP are claiming they're going to reduce people's bills by a third if we're independent. Absolutely nonsense. They've got nothing to back it up whatsoever. And when we talk about a plan, it matters because Scotland has missed climate targets before. A plan that is light on detail and vague on milestones risks repeating that pattern. If this government wants to get to net zero by 2045, then they need to be honest with people. How much it will all cost, what will it mean for air travel, what it will mean for car travel, what it will mean for people when they're trying to heat their homes. But the SNP government are not being honest. I will give way.
Kevin Stewart.
I thank Mr Lumsden for giving way. And he's highlighted cheaper electricity, and I think that in order to reach net zero we need cheaper electricity. But we also need more electricity. That does not need to come from nuclear, it comes from renewables here. But we need a grid to deal with that increased amount of electricity. Does Mr Lumsden support increasing the capacity of the grid?
Douglas Lumsden.
If only we had an energy strategy, then we could maybe look at what we need. We should have a proper energy mix with nuclear, with oil and gas, with renewables. This government seems to put all its eggs into one basket with renewables. What we need is electricity that's cheap, not the renewables that were coming forward that is much more expensive. And it's back to the point, the SNP government are not being honest. They're not telling people what the push for net zero by 2045 will mean for households. They're not telling people who live in a flat why they will have to pay up to 10 times more to charge an EV than if you have your own driveway. They're not telling our oil and gas workers that they don't support projects like Rosebank, vital for the jobs in the North East. They're not being honest, Presiding Officer, for the simple fact that there's an election in 63 days. I will give way.
Because I think it's important.
Before I call you, there is plenty of time in hand, plenty of opportunities to make interventions, although it's the decision of the person on their feet whether or not they take their interventions. So can we please have a little less shouting across the chamber? Make an intervention instead. Stephen Kerr.
I'm grateful to Douglas Lumsden for giving way. I think it's important to note that last night on debate night, the Deputy Leader of the SNP was explicit in the fact that he didn't support new oil and gas exploration and extraction licences in the North Sea, and specifically mentioned Rosebank. They're against it.
Douglas Lumsden.
Absolutely. I think they let the cat out the bag last night with Keith Brown on debate night. We all know that they've got a presumption against oil and gas, and that was made clear last night by Keith Brown. And when they're not being honest, they're also not being honest with community groups right across Scotland who are angry with the scale of energy infrastructure projects sweeping the countryside. I'll give way to Keith Brown.
You now have the opportunity, on behalf of Stephen Kerr, who is supporting you in this, to answer the question I did ask last night. Will you support the removal of the energy levy, which your party introduced, which is now supported by the Labour Party? Quite an important issue, because all the industry leaders say that is the thing that's losing most jobs in the energy sector.
Always through the chair. Douglas Lumsden.
100%. We've been calling for the scrapping of the energy profits levy for a long time, because there is no windfall. Just absolutely. But at least we know where they stand on oil and gas. Now, I was going to say the committee heard directly from community groups right across Scotland. These are local residents, community councils and volunteers who are trying to engage in good faith with the planning process and the energy transition. So it was deeply disturbing to see the Cabinet Secretary dismiss concerns around energy infrastructure as narratives linked to the far right. That kind of language is not only wrong, it's damaging, it undermines trust, it polarises the debate and it risks shutting down legitimate participation in the planning process. And I would invite the Cabinet Secretary to take this opportunity to apologise to those individuals and groups who she has labelled far right. Groups and communities that care about where they live, groups that she refuses to meet, that she denigrates in the press and badmouths to the public. How can she claim to represent her constituency when she shows such disregard for its residents? She should be absolutely ashamed. And I'm sorry, Presiding Officer, if my language is less than parliamentary, but you will understand my disgust at the phrase that was used by the Cabinet Secretary in describing my neighbours and friends as far right. A just transition requires partnership with communities, not rhetoric directed at them. The language from the Cabinet Secretary directed at those communities just shows what a disgusting organisation the SNP are, trying to discredit communities who dare to speak up and then brand them far right in the hope of shutting them up. Well, these communities will not be silenced because they are doing something that the SNP...
Mr Lumsden, could you please resume your seat? Point of order, Claire Hawkey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I respectfully ask for your ruling on some of the language that Mr Lumsden has been using, which personally I find very offensive and is not becoming of a member of this chamber, I believe.
Thank you, Ms Hawkey. I accept your point of order. I would remind members of the requirement for courtesy and respect. I would suggest that the temperature of this debate has gone up a few notches in the last 10-15 minutes. I would invite Mr Lumsden to bring his remarks to a close, but to moderate the language where possible.
Thank you. I'm not sure what language was some people took offence to, because these communities will not be silenced, because they're doing something that the SNP are failing to do, and that is stand up for rural Scotland. And only the Scottish Conservatives are working with communities, listening to them and providing them with a common-sense plan to tackle climate change. Net zero will only be achieved with the support of the people of Scotland. That support cannot be commanded, it must be earned, and right now the SNP are failing on all counts. Thank you, President Officer.
Thank you. I now call Sarah Boyack, again a similarly generous 6 minutes. Ms Boyack.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Follow that. I am pleased to open this debate on behalf of Scottish Labour as we discuss right across the chamber this draft climate change plan, because this is a document, when it is finalised, that will shape Scotland's environmental, economic and social future for decades to come. And it has to be a plan that gets it right, because the risks are so high for our constituents, for our land, for everything in terms of our economy. Over recent months, I've been involved in scrutinising the plan through the Economy Committee, Net Zero Committee, and through meetings with the Climate Change Plan team and the advisory group. And I've attempted to engage constructively with the Cabinet Secretary, sharing concerns, giving lots of suggestions about how we actually improve this climate change plan, because it's got to work. And I want to thank all those that have been involved in the consultation exercises that have been carried out across Parliament, particularly by the Net Zero Committee, to engage people in this, because this is not something a document can do. We have all got to do this together. And I think the challenge is that although across the plan there are areas of ambition, there's also areas where the ambition is missing entirely, and where priorities have been chosen, there are some key elements have been left behind. I think it was excellent today to hear from a raft of parliamentary committees: health, local government, rural affairs, culture. This plan is going to affect all of our committees, and it's going to need cross-government action. And I think that's absolutely critical. And I think we need investment and action now, right across the government, and a plan for the future. I'm very conscious that the Climate Change Plan team is analysing the consultation, the feedback that they've had, and the final report will be published at the end of the month. The challenge is, by the end of the month, the Parliament will have dissolved. So this has got to be a challenge and an opportunity for the next Parliament to make sure that there's a focus on that climate change plan, because the delivery is going to be absolutely critical. And the Climate Change Committee report makes it clear that there are gaps in delivery, gaps in understanding and gaps in the practical steps that are needed to meet legally binding targets. And the Climate Change Committee's warning on the second and third carbon budgets is particularly stark. Yes, I take the convener.
Thank you very much for taking an intervention, and I echo many of the words you say about the challenges facing the next Parliament. But one of the biggest challenges, I would suggest, if I may, Presiding Officer, is for the next Parliament to make sure that they're not in this position where they're discussing the draft climate change plan at the fag end of the Parliament, and they do it much earlier on so that people can be involved in it and see the plan when it's properly laid.
Well, the opportunity for the next Parliament is that there will be a final plan that they can scrutinise, that they can have a focus on. And given the huge turnover of parliamentarians, I actually think it's absolutely critical that the next Parliament prioritises a cross-government, a cross-party discussion on this as soon as they are returned. Because I think there are so many things that need to be addressed. Electrification has been talked about by several colleagues, and I do think that one of the most concerning omissions in the plan is the absence of any real consideration on solar power. It is one of the cheapest, quickest to deploy renewable techs available, yet it's hardly present in the plan. Solar Energy UK has been clear in its evidence that the absence of solar and battery storage is a major strategic failure that does risk undermining our wider energy ambitions. And the Scottish Government should maintain the ambition of the 4 to 6 gigawatt solar capacity by 2030, but also go further to commit to a 9 gigawatt target for 2035. And that could include rooftop solar, ground-mounted solar farms that are now compatible with agriculture, and think about where battery storage fits in. We need a joined-up plan. I think Solar Energy have also called for a sector deal for solar to recognise that the tech can make a real contribution. And I want to focus on the issue of housing, if it's very brief.
Stephen Kerr. Will she add nuclear to that portfolio of sources of energy that we need in order to sustain our economy?
Sarah Boyd.
I have actually done that on many occasions, because next door to my constituency is Torness, and Torness has hundreds of people working there, skills and knowledge. So it's not about building a nuclear plant everywhere, it's using the tech that is available now where we can use it. So we don't have to import nuclear-powered electricity from down south. But I want to come back to my point about solar, because the point made by the Climate Change Committee was that we are not meeting our heat pumps targets fast enough, and in fact it's been kicked into the second and third budgets. We need to make sure that all of our homes have proper opportunities. So I think the withdrawal of grants for solar panels was a step backwards, because it stopped many people who were about to do a heat pump installation and knew that if they put solar panels on, it would reduce their energy costs. But no, that's not now happening. And it's a huge missed opportunities for supply chains. And I particularly want to focus on the fact that 25% of our homes in Scotland are tenements. So here's a bit of heavy lifting for the final plan. How do we do that? Because you're allowed to have joint work in tenements to bring people together to repair and maintain tenements. Why don't we have an option for solar heat and for heat networks? We need to think about the practicalities of how this is going to work, because after years waiting for the energy strategy, we need action now. And I would say in our urban areas, actually also our rural areas, heat networks, from the conferences I've been to, are a practical solution. All the authorities have got a plan, but they need the investment and they need support to implement it. Transport's also been mentioned by several colleagues. We need a more realistic approach. Yes, we need EVs and charging infrastructure, and there has been progress, but we particularly need to focus on affordable solutions. Not everyone's going to be able to afford an EV, or at the disability conference we had here a couple of weeks ago, not everyone's able to drive. So we need affordable public transport. And our bus passes are brilliant, but you need the bus to use it on. So we need buses, particularly in our rural areas, and to enable people to get to work. Agriculture and land use requires a lot more work, and I think the comments made by the Rural Committee convener were very important. Farmers and crofters are willing to be part of the transition, but they need clarity, they need support, they need fair funding, and we need to have a public conversation about it. The environmental impacts of imported food, the water footprint of global supply chains, the emissions associated with different types of products. We need to support our domestic producers so that they have a fair transition and that it's viable. We also need to look at forestry targets which are off track. Peatland restoration, we spent a lot of time talking about in the Net Zero Committee. There is a huge amount of work to be done here, because we can lead on those issues, but there are barriers in delivery. But they're central if we're going to meet our carbon budgets, but also protect our natural environment. Because let's remember, it's a climate and nature crisis, and we need joined-up solutions. We also need action on industrial emissions, and the energy issue is key to that, but there's also support. If we've got a clear plan, if we've got supply chains that are confident going forward, then industry will make investment. And if we partner with GB Energy, use the National Wealth Fund, we can get investment that will deliver the energy infrastructure we need. The Climate Change Committee has also highlighted the need for credible monitoring and evaluation, because we're not going to have annual targets, but we need annual pathways for sectoral emissions and a clear indicator of progress, so that when progress isn't being made, we don't wait 5 years for a catch-up. We actually get on track and do the work now. And accountability has got to be built into the system, not added on as an afterthought. Now, the Net Zero Committee also recommends that we need a comprehensive mix of performance indicators across the breadth of the plan. But I think one of the best ideas was a dashboard. A dashboard that would be accessible to the public so that they can see what they can contribute, they can see what progress is being made, and we can actually see where we make progress, but also where we need a catch-up. And bringing people with us is going to be critical, because people need support, but they also need to understand the benefits of tackling this climate emergency, because we know that over 400,000 homes and buildings in Scotland are now at risk of flooding in the next decade. That's a real issue. That's not a theoretical issue. And we need to tackle the risk of flooding. We need to tackle the risk of sea level rise, because there are constituencies right across the country where coastal areas are now vulnerable. And that's going to put homes and businesses at risk, and the insurance sector are already lobbying us about this. So we need a credible climate change plan. I take it I'll be coming to my conclusion now. Thank you, Presiding Officer. Long-term action is not where we need to be. It's about planning now, so that the first 5, the second 5 and the third 5 years, we've got a plan for industry, we've got a plan for homeowners, we've got a plan for every sector of our economy, because the plan has got to have resilience, adaptation and preparedness, and that's going to need cross-government thinking. I hope that the Cabinet Secretary can take away the fact that all the committees that have been engaged in this discussion have called for more action, more clarity, and that we need to get on with it. We cannot wait, because we're almost at the end of this session and we're debating the draft plan. The next term needs to debate the final plan and get on with the action. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Boyack. I now call Mark Ruskell again. Similarly generous, 6 minutes.
Thank you for your generosity, Presiding Officer. And it's been 7 years since Nicola Sturgeon's government declared a climate emergency, and that declaration was important. It was a moment of leadership. It was about leadership across government to accelerate climate action. And it was also about the opportunities to drive investment, to create new jobs that have a long-term future, to improve the health of our communities, to make it easier to travel and live in a comfortable home, to make our economy much more resource efficient. And it was never about Scotland going it alone. It was about tried and tested solutions that have been proven around the world. It was about selling those important benefits of transition, and it was about leading that delivery, that change across our society. And when the Scottish Greens, were part of the government, we worked hard to put that emergency at the heart of the government's programme. And I think our former ministers would acknowledge that at times wasn't that easy. But we secured significant progress, and the Minister's already talked about free bus travel for under-22s, delivered by the Greens, the cap on bus fares, delivered by the Greens, many more areas of progress. But what we have seen since we left government is the SNP going to retreat on climate action, not just losing the narrative on climate, but willfully giving it away. A form of paralysis has crept in, with powerful lobby groups on one side and the limits of devolution on the other. This government refuses to move forwards. The energy strategy has been buried, heat and buildings programme dropped, traffic reduction targets abandoned, and I know that there's disquiet amongst some on the SNP backbenches about this direction of travel.
Cabinet Secretary.
The member knows full well, because it has been relayed and also in the reports, that we do have and continue to have a car use reduction target. We're looking at emissions reduction, and we're in line with the Climate Change Committee's own proposal in order to reduce car use. So we are in line with what the Climate Change Committee are saying. You might not agree with it, you might not like it, but it is wrong to say we don't have one or have somehow abandoned it. That isn't the case.
Mark Ruskell.
Well, I was at a hustings last night where an SNP MSP said he thought that the abandonment of that 20% target was a retrograde step. And I actually agree with that wing of the SNP. I think it's easy to set targets. It's easy to set traffic reduction targets. The hard work is actually having an action plan that local authorities can pick up on, that we can take forward nationally, to actually incentivise people to leave the car at home. And that has to be a mixture of measures. It has to be a balance of carrot and stick, financial incentives, improved public transport. And that's what I've been waiting to see, Cabinet Secretary, over the last 3 years since we've been out of government. And I haven't seen, all I've seen is a reduction in the target. Now, of course, there's always Westminster government to blame. And, Greens, we're never shy of taking a genuine opportunity to blame Westminster, just like the SNP. But, we must build the case for more powers in this Parliament by acting like we actually want them, by pushing up to the limit of the powers that we have now. And the reality is that over half of the levers to deliver policies and programmes in this climate plan are devolved, but the government is unwilling to commit to using them to benefit people and the climate. The climate plan should be an ambitious blueprint for a healthier, fairer, greener Scotland, but is now once again being rushed through with days to spare before dissolution. Days to spare. And it is farcical to think that this government, in fact any government, would make meaningful changes at all to a plan as a result of scrutiny from Parliament at this late stage. And it's quite clear that the die has been cast now for the next 5 years in this climate plan. And in too many areas, what I see is policies being kicked down the road for the next 5 years. And the danger here is that the Parliament will end up in exactly the same position, right here, right now, at the end of Session 7. And by that point, the net zero by 2045 target itself could be in grave danger, because the policies that we all know are needed are still locked in the too difficult to do box. But that said, the government is prepared to gamble in this plan on measures like carbon capture and storage technology, even though it has never been delivered at an effective scale anywhere in the world and is dependent on Westminster action. It's a 12-megatonne gamble, doubling the UK Climate Change Committee's recommendation on what is possible. And with Grangemouth Refinery and Amos Moran out of the cluster, Acorn is in trouble. It's reckless to gamble so much of Scotland's climate plan on a single project which investors are walking away from. The UK Climate Change Committee wants to see a contingency plan if Acorn doesn't go ahead. They've been calling for this for years. The Cabinet Secretary said last week that it's really up to the CCC to advise on a contingency plan. So I don't really care who comes up with the plan. We need the plan. And what is absolutely clear is that Acorn is a massive gamble. But, Presiding Officer, it's even more absurd that a new gas-fired power station at Peterhead is being baked into a climate plan. A climate plan. I mean, if there is one thing we could do to increase energy bills, worsen climate pollution, and make us more dependent on a fossil fuel which is running out, it would be a dash for new gas-fired power stations. Now, it's clear the government sees a new Peterhead power station as a price to pay to keep the Acorn business plan on life support. But running 2 gas power stations, years, decades after Scotland is meant to be net zero, flies in the face of climate reality. If Acorn doesn't deliver, the too difficult to do box will need to be opened. A credible pathway for aviation with demand reduction at its core, a heat and buildings plan that scales up fast and fairly, action to help farmers get off the production subsidy treadmill, and a transformation in public transport and traffic reduction must be delivered in this next carbon budget. On heat and buildings, we have 2 extremes in the plan. Firstly, zero ambition and no scale up in the next 5 years, a meagre 30,000 installations, no real incentives for industry to invest, no pathway to expand skills and capacity to deliver, and then a vast increase in delivery in the 2030s, apparently coming out of nowhere. Now, Nesta have pointed out in their briefing that a backloaded plan risks a skills cliff edge with no expanded workforce. It's as if this government wants to make Scotland dependent on gas boilers for as long as possible, just as it appears they want to make us dependent on gas for electricity generation for as long as possible. Now, if this government is searching for a social licence for action on climate change, it needs to stop worrying about the Daily Mail, and it needs to knock on the doors of unions, communities and sectors that are ready and they are willing to step up. The solution to climate emergency are well understood, they're tested, they're being delivered at scale globally. But this plan before us today does not deliver for people and planet. It must be revised, it must be reconsidered by a new government if we're to have any chance of playing our role in tackling the climate emergency and delivering the benefits that can deliver to the people of Scotland.
Thank you very much. We now come to the open debate, and I call first Emma Harper to be followed by Stephen Kerr in 6 minutes. Ms Harper.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Firstly, I'd like to highlight the hugely beneficial way this Parliament's committees have worked independently but coherently on how their own remit interacts with the Climate Change Plan. The Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee has been the lead, but 7 other committees of the Parliament also carried out their own inquiries and investigations, including the Rural Affairs and Islands and Health, Social Care and Sport Committees, which I sit on. This collaboration and holistic approach, working across policy areas, is a model, Presiding Officer, for similar work in the next Parliament, not just in 5 years' time when the next climate change plan is updated. So I'm proud that Scotland has a government and a parliament that recognises the need to address climate change and biodiversity loss, and that making the changes needed across our society is crucial not only for our country and our planet, but that these changes will help drive innovation, prosperity and a healthier future. That latter point has been key to Health, Social Care and Sport Committee's work on the plan. We heard from experts who were open and generous with their time and knowledge. The ongoing work around Good Food Nation dovetails with the need to tackle climate change. Utilising as far as possible local food producers and agribusinesses in the public and private sectors helps reduce emissions, means generally healthier food and keeps more money in local economies, helping boost demand in the community. Unlocking that economic potential by taking action to support local production is a key example of how measures enacted to help the environment can also have a significant multiplier effect in our economy and for our health as well. And I hope we see an increased emphasis on the importance of food production chains and their impact on their environment when the final climate change plan is published. And while we heard a range of evidence on the impact of ultra-high processed foods on both health and the environment, to my mind it's clear that the increased energy costs and the growing complexity of the food system related to UHP foods has a noticeable impact on the route to net zero, and it's something that both collectively and as individuals we can do something to change that narrative. Presiding Officer, as well as reducing emissions by producing and buying local, agriculture has a key role to play in our climate journey. And yesterday I was really chuffed to be invited to provide a keynote speech at the Scottish ADBA conference at Dynamic Earth. This is the Anaerobic Digestion and Bioresources Association. The Cabinet Secretary, Gillian Martin, was also there and was warmly welcomed by the association. Anaerobic digestion is now so ready to be more mainstreamed. We've got small, medium and large plants that are available, and the innovation that we are now being made, that we're now seeing in terms of research and development. They're seeing the processing of on-farm waste and other organic matters, and delivering renewable energy and decentralised energy networks in our rural communities cannot be understated. We know that AD, as well as solar, as Sarah Boyack has mentioned, AD can be part of the mix of energy generation leading to our energy security. And I spoke about that yesterday as well, especially when we're seeing what's happening in the Middle East right now. And I know AD isn't going to fix the whole problem, but I think it would be worth considering that as we move forward. When I addressed the association, I highlighted the fact that while Galloway alone has just over 20 AD plants out of Scotland's 90 or so, we've got over 500 dairy farms. And that potential that is being unleashed by facilities like Crofthead Biogas near Crocketford, processing up to 100,000 tonnes of organic farm waste and turning it into 8 megawatt-hours equivalent, with innovators like the carbon removers behind not just the technology, but leading the way on CO2 sequestration as well. And, Presiding Officer, the Net Zero innovation is being supported right now through South of Scotland Enterprise, an agency delivered by the SNP government and making a difference right now to the South's economy. The Scottish Government and its agencies are investing in the innovation and jobs that will sustain our rural communities for years to come. And, Presiding Officer, I've touched on only a fraction of how the South is a hotbed of research, innovation and practical application of the ways we will hit net zero in the future. And yesterday again I highlighted the fact that the South West of Scotland had the first offshore wind, first onshore wind. It's got a 90-year-old hydroelectric scheme. We've got solar arrays, and I think the South West of Scotland could be the renewables capital of Scotland, actually. So this is only part of what we investigated in both committee inquiries. And as a former operating theatre nurse, I was really interested in what Professor Sir Gregor Smith's evidence was when he presented about the Green Theatre's progress. So there's been changes in anaesthesia, in the gas that's used to delivery, which is not good for our climate. So I want to thank the committee clerks with their forbearance with my ultra-high processed food climate change research and the evidence that's emerging around that. I also want to thank the rural clerks for all their work supporting committee members and everybody who gave us evidence both at Health Committee and at Rural Committee as well. The plan is a substantial piece of work, and as each of us goes our separate ways in just a few weeks, we should all take heart that the demands of the 21st century in repairing the mistakes of the 20th century are at the top of this Parliament's and our Government's agenda, and I commend the plan to the Chamber. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Ms Harper. I now call Stephen Kerr to be followed by Paul McLean. Around 6 minutes, Mr Kerr.
Thank you for the around 6 minutes. Presiding Officer, I know we get slightly overexcited on this side of the chamber on certain subjects, but nothing, I think, quite triggers the Conservative MSPs in this chamber to listen to SNP members wax lyrical with great virtue oozing from their pores about the EPL. I mean, they must think, members on that side must think that we've got no memory. We remember. In fact, it's recorded in the official report, that they were clamouring for an excess profits levy on the energy companies. They were clamouring for it. In fact, not only did they want excess profit levies on the energy companies, they wanted them on a bunch of other companies in other sectors as well. Such was their desire to tax the capitalist organisations that were making money. And of course, now they, Kevin Stewart among them, he often gets up to say, oh, it's a terrible thing, the EPL. Well, they were the ones that wanted it. They were the ones that wanted it extended, and we're the ones now that have been clear for a very long time we want it ended. Yes, I will.
Kevin Stewart.
I thank the member for giving way. I would remind him that it was a Conservative government that introduced the Energy Profits Levy at a time where energy profits were extremely high because of the Russian illegal invasion of Ukraine. Times have changed dramatically. That was supposed to be for a short term. That short term is now long term. It needs to go. The Conservatives should have ended it. They didn't. Now Labour must end it to save jobs in Aberdeen, the North East and beyond.
Stephen Kerr.
Well, the Conservatives did have a plan to end it. And the Scottish Conservatives have had a plan to end it for very much longer, something that at the time we made very clear through our then leader and indeed our collective voice. I'm sorry, Kevin Stewart, but I think, and I know where his constituency interests lie, and I could see the pain he felt when it was brought up what Keith Brown, the Deputy Leader of the SNP, had said on debate night last night. To be against exploration licences, to be against extracting the energy resources that are right there within British territorial waters, the same energy resources that Norway is successfully making the best of, and I could also sense that members were upset because my friend Douglas Lumsden called the SNP a disgusting party. He comes from a position of angst about the state of what's happening in the North East economy. I will come to Keith Brown in a moment. And he was only quoting the words of John Swinney, actually, because he used that very term in First Minister's questions, which we thought was slightly at the edge of things. And we've not forgotten, and neither shall we. I give way to Keith Brown.
Keith Brown.
But we have a new floor for parliamentary language, and once again that floor has been set by the Conservatives. But going back to the point that Stephen, I didn't realise he was my #1 fan and following my media appearances, but thanks for that. Can I ask? I did ask last night, though, since you're watching. Does the Conservative Party still believe, or does it again believe, in climate change and the need to address it?
Stephen Kerr.
Never disguise the fact that we are very much, it's in the name of the party actually, we believe in conserving our natural environment. Of course we do. But what we are saying is, let's wake up about these arbitrary targets that we set and what they're doing to our economy. And that's what I want to get on to, because that's very much the thrust of what this debate should be about, the climate change plan that we've been reviewing. And I have in my hand here the submission of the Economy and Fair Work Committee, which I think is an excellent piece of work by all of the committee members, including members of, in fact, I think the only party not represented are the Liberal Democrats. I think everyone else is represented. And what does it say in here? Well, Well, let me tell you what my conclusion from this document
Mr. Kerr,
is.
would
I'm
you
not
stop
allowed to
waving
use
your
props.
props around? I'll give you a little latitude, but
I'm not allowed to use props, but I've got in my hand then, underneath this lectern, I have a letter which contains the report of the committee. Now, we were told that this climate change plan is a serious blueprint for delivering net zero by 2045, but the evidence we heard in the Economy and Fair Work Committee, after that evidence, I can't accept that description, because what we have is not a credible climate change plan. It's an emissions reduction wish list, light on detail, heavy on assumption, and dangerously detached from economic reality. Now, one of the memorable pieces of evidence given to our committee was by Professor Paul Deleuze, who, and I quote what he said, because I think he sums it up rather well. He said when he was reading the plan, he had a little IKEA moment. He said, this is what he said: I know what the starting point is, which is a flat pack, and I know what the end point looks like, which is net zero, but what I am missing is the instructions and the plan in the middle. And that was a very succinct and to-the-point comment, which I think summarises the total evidence that we received as a committee in relation to this. And by the way, David Thompson of the Food and Drink Federation Scotland said his members, quote, would probably struggle to see the link between the plan and the actions, whether financial support, policy support or legislative support. It's not joined up. It's not joined up. The targets may well be clear, but the pathway is not. So let's be honest now about how Scotland has reduced, in fact, how the UK has reduced its industrial emissions in the past. Since 1990, emissions from industry have fallen sharply. But that has not primarily been because we've cracked the code of industrial decarbonisation. It has all too often been because plants are being closed. Steelworks have shut. Paper mills have shut. Refineries and chemical facilities are shutting. And emissions have been cut by shutting industry. Ask the workers at Grangemouth. Ask the workers at Mossmoran. Ask those across the North East oil and gas sector whether this feels like a just transition. What they see is their jobs disappearing faster than any serious alternative is being created. And this was the comment that our committee received, if I may share this with the Chamber. Let me find it. I'm not supposed to have a prop, but I am referring to the letter. And this is what Professor Deleuze said. I'm quoting from the letter. Paul Deleuze said Scotland was losing more of its supply chain and workforce capacity than was being replaced by offshore wind and carbon capture and storage. He argued that strategic investment at scale ahead of a final approval of projects was now required. He observed that between now and the early 2030s, the majority of wind activities would not be in Scotland, but the rest of the world. Happy to give way to my fellow committee member.
I absolutely agree that we need more investment in industrial capacity. Would the member agree that we haven't seen the wind farms being produced in Scotland, that were huge opportunity for turbines? With one plant it went, we need more because we need more joined up economic opportunities to actually build the country we need.
Stephen Kerr.
We keep saying, Sarah Boyack, we keep saying, oh, well, the opportunity is going to lie in the supply chain, the onshore supply chain. It's not there. And we keep saying, oh, we need to have the onshore supply chain. But then we don't take the public policy decisions that will drive and invite and attract that investment into our country. Now, the reality is that we are de-industrialising our economy while we are industrialising our countryside. We see turbines, pylons, substations spreading across rural Scotland, yet we import the steel, the turbines and the workers to install them. This is not green prosperity. This is exporting value and importing dependency. And as already been mentioned by me and others in an intervention on the I can't remember who I intervened on to talk about the cost of electricity. Oh, it was Douglas Lumsden. I wanted to intervene on the Cabinet Secretary because she's not wrong about the cost of electricity, the most expensive electricity in the Western developed world. How's our business base, our industrial base, intended to prosper? And I am being a bit loud, because if you can't get excited by what is happening to our economy because of these arbitrary targets we set, then what are you going to get excited about? Because the whole basis of our country, our economy, our society, our public services, depends on our willingness to see that our economy is well-founded and grows. I'm well over time. Am I being told I must close? Do I get a minute?
You begin winding up.
I begin winding up. So, yeah, that's a separate matter from my colleague there. Let me just finish by saying that we're not in climate denial, Keith Brown. We're not in climate denial. We're calling for responsible government, because Scotland accounts for a tiny fraction of global emissions, and we will not change the global climate by hollowing out our industrial base. What we will do is make ourselves poorer, more dependent and less secure. Energy policy is not simply an environmental issue. It is about national resilience, economic strength and security of supply, and we need a reset.
Thank you, Mr Carr. I now call Paul McLennan to be followed by Kevin Stewart. Again, around 6 minutes, Mr McLennan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. How do you follow that? How do you follow that? Thank you for the opportunity to speak today on the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee's report. I think it's for 26 to 2040. Can I give thanks, obviously, to the committee and to the clerks? We are in a defining decade in our fight against climate change, and this report, I think, serves as a critical friend as we go ahead in that. Now, we are, I think, we're talking around about what the committee is looking at this, but I think we're in a politically defining period as well. We could be in another parliament in a number of months where we have 15 to 20 reform MSPs, potentially, where the polls are showing us, who deny climate change. I've been at hustings, as others up here, who flatly deny climate change. Kemi Badenoch, Mr Kerr as well, hasn't been particularly supportive in terms of the challenge against net zero as well. So hand in hand they are in terms of that. Scotland has set an ambitious target, net zero emissions by 2045. And I think the draft climate change plan does outline policies such as transport, energy, waste, agriculture and buildings. And we've all heard that to meet our carbon targets over the next 15 years. But our ambition it shouldn't just be alone enough. We need delivery. And of course, that's really important. And I'll come on to that. The Scottish Parliament, as we all know, undertook a 120-day review with the Net Zero Committee leading the charge. They examined the plan's governance, monitoring and fiscal aspects, which of course is really important. And of course, we've heard from other committees here today. But what has emerged and what's really important is a clear consensus. Scotland obviously needs to regain momentum in our net zero journey. And I'll touch on some of the impacts that's had in terms of why we haven't progressed as quickly as we have. Now, I think there are a couple of key things for me. At its core, the report obviously talks around about that the final climate change plan has to prioritise delivery. So concrete policies have to be backed up by clear targets, timelines, assigned leadership and, where possible, of course, costings. And that's not just in terms of government, that's across all. That's not just in government, we've heard the role of local authorities, and also in the role of communities, which I'll touch on later on in the speech. A robust monitoring system is also essential to track progress and obviously to flag risks early. We can't be coming down 2 or 3 years down the line and realising where we are in terms of that. So we have to be able to monitor this on an annual basis and continue to do that. The draft obviously talks about electrification across the economy, but that brings challenges, like ensuring affordable electricity through collaboration with the UK Government. Now, a number of months ago, I had TANESO in to the Parliament, and there was a number of MSPs who went along and spoke to that. Grid capacity is essential, is really, really important in terms of doing that, but we need closer collaboration with the UK Government in terms of that. And grid capacity, as I said, is essential. And I'm coming from a point down in East Lothian where we've got the Eastern Green Link that's being built, which is exporting energy down to England. So grid capacity has to be closer collaboration with the UK Government. I know the Cabinet Secretary has been talking on that. So there is dependencies, I think, on external factors from Westminster. The reliance, obviously, on private industry to do so. And that heightens risks, as do ambitious assumptions around about rapid electrical vehicle adoption. Now, there's been debates around about where we take electrical vehicle adoption in terms of that. I think that's important. Ariane Burgess talked around about home heat decarbonisation and, of course, emissions technologies as well. But I want to turn to some other key sectors that are under our own remit. In energy supply, the government's plan for renewables and grid upgrades is positive, but we do need more to scale up. And again, this really comes back, and I know the Cabinet Secretary has been dealing with this, on how serious the UK Government are on that particular point. The UK Government were behind the curve for a number of years, and they're now catching up, but that's impacting on our ability to grow the renewable sector. That's something that the UK Government needs to pick up and move on a much quicker basis. We do need, I think as well, clear pathways to decarbonise energy from waste. In Rad, and I have an energy from waste plant in my constituency. I met with Veridor in discussing that particular point. So I think, again, emissions protections around about that, I think, are key as we move forward. Yeah, of course.
Stephen Kerr.
Thanks to Paul McLennan for giving way. He talks about, and I don't doubt, his commitment to green and clean energy sources. But why does he not accept what the European Union now accept, which is that nuclear is a clean energy source, and it's something that we should be investing in for our energy and national security?
Paul McLennan.
As he knows, I have the nuclear power station in my constituency. And when it comes down to it, I think there's a number of reasons why we look at renewables going forward. The strike price is considerably cheaper for renewables as going forward. And when we will have a disagreement, I know Mr Lumsden and I had a disagreement and a debate around about that. It is, in terms of that, to deliver that. And I think that's something we'll continue to disagree on. I want to come back to... Yeah, of course.
Cabinet Secretary.
I actually have the strike prices here. Hinkley Point strike price is £92.50. Onshore wind is per megawatt hour, and onshore wind is 64, and solar is 61.
Before I ask Paul McLennan to resume, could we resist the temptation to shout out rather than ask for interventions? Paul McLennan.
Thank you, President Officer. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that? And I think that's an important point, because it's all around about how important it is to the consumer. And how much cheaper it is to consumers. So that's really important. We've got a third of people in Scotland in fuel poverty. So how we tackle climate change and what we do around about that is incredibly important. I want to talk around about... I want to move on, Mr Kerr, in terms of that. I want to talk about transport. And of course that's a major emitter in terms of air. So it talks about modal shifts. It encourages walking, cycling, public transport, and obviously reducing car dependency. So we've talked about incentives through like bus travel for under 22s and investments in active travel infrastructure. I think one of the key things as well, again talking about walking, people will know that, since I had my little health scare, I've done lots and lots of walking and seen the benefits of that. And I think one of the key things that we've heard from, for example, from Walking Scotland was around about an ambition of a £50 million path fund, and that's been discussed. That's something I would try and support and obviously encourage government to look at as we move forward. Now, we need to encourage walking, for example, and cycling for health, leisure, work, and support active travel hubs. Again, we're talking around about the car mileage usage, and again, I think that's something that we need to be looking at as well, and Cabinet Secretary Fiona Hislop talked on that. Bus patronage has dropped also since COVID. I think the Scottish Government obviously looked at incentives to get people back in, such as the under-22 bus travel, and obviously the capped bus costs. Freight decarbonisation, I think, is really important as well. I'm conscious of the time.
I can give you the time back, Mr.
That's fine. Yeah.
Sarah Boyack.
I very much appreciate the member taking intervention, because there is an issue about young people using their bus pass or older people using their bus pass, because we have lost hundreds of bus routes, and areas like East and Mid Lothian, West Lothian and Edinburgh, we've got Lothian buses, but there are other parts of the country where they don't have any bus services, and it's a real challenge. And would that be something the member would agree should be in the final plan, support for new bus services?
Paul McLennan.
I think that's really important, because I know that, for example, the East Lothian Council, I know it supports bus routes by about £1 million a year. There's a bus route development grant. I know that the government has worked with local bus companies and the bus companies nationally on that as well. So I think that's really important, how we encourage that. Just coming back to freight decarbonisation, I think that's one of the key things as well. Obviously 80% of operators are small businesses, so how we work with them in terms of that is really important. I think there must be more measures to deter car use through maybe demand management and so on, and looking at maybe multi-year funding and integrated ticketing as well. I think that's important. And coming back to the point it was said about rural access and to public transport, is really important. Again, I think on waste, I think there's really important in terms of the draft circular on that. And I think we need tighter timelines on reducing emissions from landfills and incineration. So again, that's coming from a local aspect. In terms of that, I want to talk around about the work, and I've raised this in the Chamber before, about the work of the East Lothian Climate Hub. And East Lothian climate change and environment obviously impact us all. So for increasing flooding, to food affordability, the livelihoods of farmers, access to green slopes. This impacts everybody in East Lothian. So the Climate Hub, for me, has done some fantastic work in working with local communities. And I remember asking the Cabinet Secretary on this point, what we need to do to embed this plan as well is make sure they're embedded in our local communities. And the role of the Climate Hub, I think, has done an amazing amount of work in that regard. So last Friday, I spent time with them restoring hedgerows in Trinent, believe it or not, found it very therapeutic. But again, the impact it had is important. Coming back to the conclusion, Presiding Officer, I think Edward Mountain put it when he mentioned in the report, the plan must be focused on delivery with credible proposals and clear lines of accountability. Everybody agrees with that. And of course, getting it right means listening to industry, NGOs, experts and of course parliaments and other committees said the same in terms of that. So I think just before I conclude, across the board, electricity pricing reforms are vital, I think, as we move forward. And I think that's one of the issues we're talking around about. Scotland doesn't have the powers to take that forward. And when we look at how the prices are set in UK Parliament, we need these powers here in Scotland in terms of that. So this report isn't just about critique, it's about a roadmap to success. We all need to seize the moment to rebuild momentum, foster collaboration and, of course, secure a sustainable future for Scotland. Net zero isn't optional, it's our legacy, and together we can deliver it. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Kevin Stewart to be followed by Mercedes Vialba. Around 6 minutes. Mr Stewart.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I welcome the draft climate change plan. But I would like to say, and it hasn't been said enough today, that in order for us to deliver, we have to have complete and utter cooperation from the UK Government as well in terms of the change that is required, because this cannot be done with the powers of this Parliament or this Government alone. And I welcome that this Parliament has set world-leading climate emission targets, but targets, of course, are not results. So we must move from the what would we like to see happen to how are we going to make it happen, and that how is fundamentally economic. Rules, regulations and well-meaning soundbites are pointless unless the people of Scotland see a positive change in their lives and, most importantly, positivity in their pooches and their purses. Because, putting it bluntly, what we need to do to ensure that we meet our climate change targets in Scotland is entirely dependent on lowering electricity bills, in my opinion. If we want people to switch to heat pumps and electric vehicles, the numbers must work for the person in the street. And currently, the numbers aren't working. Scots are seeing their bills go up rather than down. And the central reason for this is that the energy market is fundamentally flawed. We have the absurd situation where clean, green electricity generated right here in Scotland is based on the cost of imported international gas prices. And this marginal pricing system is a relic of the past, and we need to remove the tie from natural gas prices, something that the previous Conservative government failed to do, and something that this current Labour government seem unwilling to do. It is a nonsense to ask Scottish families to decarbonise their lives while charging them a premium dictated by the volatility of global fossil fuel markets. And we just have to look at yet another American war in the Middle East to see the folly of that. However, we also need to be honest about the role of hydrocarbons in our future electricity generation. It's a simple fact. I'll give way to Mr Kerr.
Stephen Kerr.
Grateful to Kevin Stewart for giving way. I appreciate that. I'd like to read something to him very quickly and ask him if he agrees with it. Evidence repeatedly pointed to electricity prices that are materially higher than those faced by overseas competitors, driven in large part by policy regulatory and system costs rather than the generation costs alone. Does he agree with that? And does that not indicate that we are responsible for the direction of electricity prices more than the market?
The UK government is responsible, and one of the main difficulties, one of the reasons why we have the highest electricity prices in Europe is because of that flawed situation where we tie electricity costs to the price of international gas. It is absolutely daft. The Tories should have got rid of that. The Labour Party should get rid of it. In order for us to get this right and to make it right for Scots who are being overcharged at this moment to a huge degree for this electricity, that tie needs to be cut once and for all. And I was saying that there is a role for hydrocarbons in our future electricity generation. It's a simple fact that the sun does not always shine and the wind does not always blow. And because of this, our electricity network must have capacity to power our homes without renewables for up to 10 days at a time. Battery storage will be part of that solution. I hope that hydrogen will be part of that solution. But there has to be a sense of reality here. We do need backup. And so natural gas will remain vital for many decades to come. Not just now, thank you. However, that doesn't mean we cannot reduce the climate impact of using that natural gas. I give you Acorn, and we need to invest in Acorn no matter what some of the sceptics in here say. It is environmental barbarism to halt our own production only to import gas from the war-torn Middle East or Trump's America. The carbon dioxide footprint of shipping liquefied natural gas across the Atlantic is obscene. We should also use locally sourced hydrocarbons to reduce emissions from our energy production. Now, unit marginal pricing isn't the only problem. Transmission charges and regional pricing also need to change. Because we have the equally absurd situation where clean, green electricity generated right here in Scotland is priced based on the cost of sending that energy to London. The current transmission charging system charges people in Scotland more and people in London less to encourage energy production near energy demand in London. And I'll take Mr Lumsden.
Douglas Lumsden.
I thank Kevin Stewart for taking the intervention. I agree with him that we should be using our own hydrocarbons rather than rely on imported oil and gas. So then, does he disagree with his own party's stance against Rosebank and Jackdaw that would provide that hydrocarbons that we can use in this country?
Kevin Stewart.
Up to the SNP or the Scottish Government or the Scottish Parliament to give the go-ahead for Rosebank or for Campbell or for anything else. That's a matter for the UK Government. And we have said here that that has to be looked at in terms of the environmental impact and energy security. But it's not only us that have said that. The UK courts have said that the UK Government has to do that too. I would suggest that the UK Government needs to put together, because they're the ones unfortunately in charge at the moment, the environmental impact assessments and the energy security strategies in order to get this right. I am not against new fields, but I think we need to ensure the reasoning for that. And I think if those works were carried out, it would show the need for future development. But forget new fields. We should be drilling in existing areas, as the Norwegians are doing at this moment in time. Again, something that the UK Government is failing to do. I was speaking about transmission charges. They must be changed to reflect the cost of local production alongside regional pricing. And that will allow the free market to bring energy-intensive industries back to Scotland. This will not only revitalise the Scottish economy and lower bills, but it will also eliminate the vast carbon dioxide footprint of transporting electricity from Scotland to England. Finally, we must address the elephant in the room, our housing stock. Tenements make up only 2% of the UK's housing, But in Scotland, they represent 25%. And in places like the centre of Aberdeen, in my constituency, well over half of the homes are tenements. To Whitehall, and indeed to the Climate Change Committee, I would say that they think that tenements are the last 2% to be solved. In Scotland, tenements must be one of the first problems that we solve. If we cannot decarbonise the tenements in our cities, we will not meet our targets either. It is as simple as that. And we simply cannot wait for a one-size-fits-all UK solution that ignores the reality of Scottish cities. And again, in order to get this right, lower electricity prices will help us do that. And to finish, let me say again, I welcome that this Parliament has set world-leading climate emissions targets, but targets are not results. And results will only be seen if we can reduce electricity prices dramatically, which I think we can do and we would do if we were an independent nation. Thank you very much.
I now call Mercedes Villalba to be followed by Bob Doris, around 6 minutes.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The draft climate change plan was developed around the principle of decarbonising our society and economy to meet Scotland's net zero goals. Whilst the plan is a welcome, crucial step to decarbonising our economy, there remains a real risk that government and business will continue to take decisions in the name of climate action without the inclusion of workers and their unions. So far, ordinary Scots have been disempowered from taking ownership of Scotland's energy transition, and they have been paying the price through job losses and the knock-on effect on our high streets, family life and mental health. Like many communities across the country, Dundee, where I live, bears the scars from Thatcher's deindustrialisation of Scotland. And further north, again in my own region, Aberdeen runs the risk of those same social and economic issues from Thatcher's legacy should we continue to fail to get the energy transition right. And any transition which fails to reckon with the concentrated hoarding of wealth, of land and of resources cannot ever be just. The choice before us, then, is between business as usual or seizing the opportunity of clean energy. Now, the Just Transition Commission's final report is clear about the necessity of an accelerated timescale in the delivery of climate action. And it's clear that a just transition can only be achieved through our workplaces, through organised labour and through our trade unions. If we do not treat the climate crisis with the urgency it demands, we run the risk of falling prey to the whims of the market, which can only benefit big business and its shareholders. We must therefore address the issues raised by the Just Transition Commission to enable a clear understanding of where climate action laid out in the Climate Change Plan should be taking us. The Just Transition Commission's report makes a number of recommendations for the Scottish Government going forward. It highlights the need for proactive, forward-thinking, place-based planning for workplaces and communities which are heavily entwined with high-polluting sectors, namely energy, transport, industry and agriculture. This will require innovative, redistributive plans for how we decarbonise and transition, along with transformative workforce planning, which means workers and families will benefit from the just transition. We must be steadfast in our opposition to decarbonisation by deindustrialisation, which would have just as disastrous an effect as the status quo. Now, I'd also like to echo the recommendations of the Net Zero Committee's report that the Scottish Government's climate change plan should include clear timelines, targets, costings, and be clear about who is responsible for delivery. In particular, the Net Zero Committee's report's point about the inclusion of data and workings is crucial for scrutiny and not something that any government should shy away from. However, given how soon the plan is to be finalised after the publication of the committee's report on the draft, I have to agree with the committee's scepticism as to the likelihood that its recommendations will actually be reflected on by the government and incorporated into the final climate change plan. Now, I do also just want to take a moment, Deputy Presiding Officer, to respond to an issue that Kevin Stewart in particular has been raising repeatedly. And I have to say, I do think he does his constituents a great injustice and disservice by propagating the myth put around by international oil conglomerates that are seeking to blame fair taxation on eye-watering profits for what is in fact their own mismanagement of the industry, an industry which should have never been allowed to fall into private hands, because energy is an issue of national security which is fundamental to our economy. But I do agree with him that we must stop our reliance on importing gas. But of course, the solution is not endless drilling, because what is there is not actually what we need, and it is gone. So the real solution, the only solution, is to pivot to a mix of renewable options, and that includes the untapped potential of geothermal, amongst other renewable options that members have raised today, including Sarah Boyack spoke passionately about solar, and of course we already know we have the option of wind and tidal. Now, to conclude, Presiding Officer, over the course of this Parliament, decisions about the energy transition have too often been taken at great distance from the workers and communities at the heart of it, particularly those in the North East region that I represent. Now, we cannot allow a just transition to remain an academic term used to greenwash industrial vandalism by an irresponsible state content to let the market decide our future. Instead, a just transition must represent something tangible in workers' lives, through the jobs it brings, through the regeneration of our environment that we'll see, and through the gains in our health and quality of life that we will feel. That will be the job of the next Parliament and the next government, but it's also the job of all of us in Scotland to hold that Parliament and that government to account. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Fiala. Well, just a reminder, it is up to the member whether they take an intervention. That's not an invitation for the intervention to be shouted from a secondary position. Call the final speaker in the open debate. Bob Doris, around 6 minutes, please.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. It's been quite an afternoon, hasn't it? These draft climate change plans before us reflect a substantial piece of work by the Scottish Government and its officials. Irrespective of people's views, a substantial piece of work, and I thank them for that. My thanks also to my colleagues on a cross-party basis within the Net Zero community in which I sit for our thoughtful scrutiny. I thought we did that very well. And of course to all those who supported the work from clerks, advisers, and of course witnesses and other committees in this place. In our consideration of the plan, we must seek to offer constructive scrutiny and, believe it or not, take a collegiate approach to working together to make what is a strategic document making long-term progress and secure delivery on the ground. You'd have be forgiven for thinking that was an ambition here this afternoon. After all, this is Scotland's climate change plan, not the Scottish Government's. It requires buy-in and strategic partnership between all levels of government, as well as from our business community, our private, public and third sectors, and as well as our communities right across Scotland. I think watching the debate this afternoon, some of them have opted out of engaging with this debate. We need them to opt in to make those lifestyle changes that we all need to see. So I think we'll have to bear that in mind when we discuss this in future, including myself, of course, Presiding Officer. If ever there was an issue to see a non-tribal work between the Scottish and UK governments, this is it. Without a successful delivery of Scotland's climate change plan, the UK plan has no chance of success. I think it's fair to say that the Cabinet Secretary indicated that relationships between the UK Government and the Scottish Government had improved in recent times, but in appropriately diplomatic language hinted there was perhaps still a wee bit of room for improvement so still work to be done more generally, let's just say. I portion no blame on that, not during this debate anyway, Mr Kerr, but that partnership has to be as close to rock solid as it ever can be between two governments in two different places from two different parties. It's just vital. And the switch to electric vehicles is a good example of why that has to be so. The draft plan includes phasing out the need for new petrol and diesel cars and vans by 2030 and ensure all road vehicles are zero emission by 2040. That success in Scotland will be dependent on a stable UK policy landscape, including zero-emission vehicle mandates, which dictate the percentage of cars and vans which are zero-emission vehicles between now and 2035. It will also be dependent on the UK's vehicle emissions trading scheme for manufacturers being successful. However, it is the Scottish Government, our local authorities, the private sector investment required and households who will be required to ensure that the charging infrastructures are in place. The Scottish Government has already invested £30 million to support the expansion of public EV charging networks, and this should deliver 24,000 additional charging points by 2030. Thankfully, also, the upfront costs of new electric cars do continue to fall and will hopefully reach parity over the next few years. Importantly, also, the resale market is increasingly strong and parity is likely to be approached much sooner than that. Now, regarding electric vehicles, the Net Zero Committee stated that there are still challenges around upfront affordability, the cost of charging and the significant inequalities that exist within that. We asked that the final plan set out how the Scottish Government intend to work with the UK Government and relevant stakeholders to overcome these barriers. For me, that means partnership between both governments to ensure that capital budgets for this place here can continue to expand both the public network but also help fund households and communities who, due to their house types, can't simply have an EV charging point in their driveway. On-street solutions for tenement and other properties will be required. Price capping on commercial EV charging regimes may also need to be considered. It would be unfair if any, but in particular low-income households, had to pay a premium to charge their vehicles because they don't have a driveway and must pay a commercial rate. That would not be acceptable, but that policy intervention will have to take place at a UK level. I also want to reflect and agree with the comments of Kevin Stewart, I think it was, in relation to the challenges in decarbonising tenemental properties in a very fair way. I've got many in my constituency, a lot of low-income households there who will really struggle to play their part as householders to do their bit. They will need support, it will need investment, and governments at all levels will have to contribute towards that. Would the member like to make an intervention?
Patrick Harvey.
Thank you. Thank the member very much. All I was going to say was that what those people need is the bill that the Scottish Government have just scrapped.
Bob Doris.
What my constituents need is the bill that's been published in draft form to be delivered in the next Parliament and take the buy-in from all parties, including the Green Party, rather than a churlish intervention just like that. I also note that the Scottish Government has moved to a 4% reduction in car mileage by 2030, as opposed to a previous 20% target. Clearly, this gives an added focus to the need to move to electric vehicles as speedily as possible. I think that target change perhaps also recognises the ongoing need for cars, and there will be an ongoing need for cars, particularly in our more rural areas, and that is an urban MSP. But as an urban MSP, for that modal switch, I would look at bus franchising, which is not a cost-free option, and SPT continue to bring forward a business model in relation to that. But even bus franchising has a challenge as well. And our net zero ambitions, will that be to get those who are using cars in the urban areas out of cars onto buses, or will it be our low-income areas who have no bus services and no cars to be better connected? So there can be a conflict. We have to be clear what the policy intent of bus franchising is, but it will need to be financially supported appropriately. Returning back to our rural areas, by nature of their geography, they will make a crucial contribution to net zero, be that through reforestation or peatland restoration. The Scottish Government has chosen an alternative balanced pathway to net zero from the Climate Change Committee, where it has not chosen to reduce livestock numbers, as the Climate Change Committee has suggested. It would seem to be for good reason. However, that does mean that peatland restoration and reforestation must now do more heavy lifting to secure net zero. The plan does that to a fashion, because the reforestation and the peatland restoration doesn't particularly upscale under the Scottish Government's plan, but new modelling work and new research shows the contribution that tree planting and peatland restoration makes is far more significant than previously thought. And in that respect, I reference the industry standard carbon for forestry and the latest research from the James Hutton Institute on peatland restoration. And now, The reason I mention that, Presiding Officer, is because that's the current, and I'll finish off shortly, Presiding Officer, that's the current latest modelling work, and that's the current latest research. But sometimes modelling changes and research changes. I think one of the things the Climate Change Committee was clear about is what is Plan B, what's the alternatives if that changes and our ambitions aren't realised as much as possible. More generally, if I've got another minute or so.
No, you don't.
My goodness, Mr Kerr really does get a lot of airtime in this place, doesn't he, Presiding Officer?
As do other colleagues, Mr Doris.
More generally then, Presiding Officer, all climate change plans by definition are almost out of date as soon as they're written, because the policy landscape changes, public budgets change, there's technological changes, modelling changes. This climate change plan has to be iterative as we go forward, but it has to be delivered. The budget is the place it must be delivered. So in the next session, if I'm lucky enough to be returned, I want to see a much clearer link between the strategy and the budget that's delivered, and more collegiate working to agree that budget on a cross-party basis in this place. Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Doris. We move to closing speech. I just advise the Chamber we have a little time in hand, but sources of generosity are vastly depleted at this stage. I call on Patrick Harvey, around 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to start by acknowledging that there has been a failure of process here. As a result of the timescale that the Scottish Government decided on, not enough time has been left for committee scrutiny to be done at the standard that the committees would wish. The UK Climate Change Committee wasn't willing or able to appear before the committees to give their evidence. And so we stand here with a committee report and a CCC report in the final days of the term of Parliament, and very little time for the Government to change the draft plan in response to the debate. But part of the failure of process is also entirely within Parliament's control. The Act says that the Government must respond to resolutions as well as reports by Parliament within 3 months, and yet the only resolution we have allowed ourselves to vote on today is a completely standard take-note motion. There is no substance and no message for Government within that resolution. So this is a failure of Parliament's process as well as the Government's process. We also have to acknowledge the context is a failure of progress, the past failures that we need to reflect on. When I think back to the first Climate Act, I remember all of that self-congratulation about target setting and the emphasis on consensus and how important that was. Even as we debated it back in 2008 and 2009, I expressed the concern that we had consensus on the destination only, not on the route, consensus on the targets, but not on the actions that would be needed. And so it proved. The failure to take bold action that was necessary to cut emissions across too many sectors, that's the reason why the 2030 target slipped out of reach. That's where we stand now as we approach the halfway point. Next year will mark the halfway point between the first Climate Act in 2009 and the net zero target of 2045. And in that first half of the journey, there's been only one solid success story: the growth of renewable electricity. Welcomed by most, opposed by a few, and it still is. But across the other sectors of the economy, transport, land use, buildings and more, we've seen emissions flatline or worse. That's the reason why Scotland is now years behind where we should be in tackling the climate emergency. And my concern now is that with the draft plan as it stands, the second half of this journey could fail just as the first half did. Looking at the draft plan, it does seem that we're setting Scotland up for future failures. The over-reliance on negative emission technology, as Mark Ruskell highlighted, perhaps the biggest risk factor in the plan. It was always a risk, but with the very obvious and all too predictable failures in the development of that technology, this risk is now turning into a 12-megatonne hole in the Scottish Government's plans. And as Mark Ruskell argued, it's a massive gamble, and it's accompanied by a proposal for a new fossil fuel power plant, an absurdity when we're years behind schedule on cutting emissions. On transport, there's a narrow emphasis on EVs. Now, of course they have a role to play, but replacing a fossil fuel car-dominated transport system with an electric car-dominated transport system will be both a failure and a missed opportunity to create a safer, healthier and fairer Scotland. Things that can be achieved through demand reduction and a shift to cheap, reliable public transport and safe, active travel. The road traffic reduction targets reductions now being proposed are far lower than the ambition that previously existed. But without a proper plan for modal shift and demand management, even these very low targets may be missed. I understand. I'm afraid I don't have time in the time that I've. The rejection of the advice on agriculture. I can understand why the government have chosen to do that in the face of opportunistic opposition by those who are determined to misrepresent the issues. But in truth, this is another missed opportunity, a missed opportunity to invest in a new and better food system and a new and better sustainable future for rural communities. In relation to heat and buildings, the government had been commended for its previous heat and buildings programme, but it has been filleted. The bill that was produced delayed until the next session, the contents stripped out of it. And not only delaying and weakening the bill, but also allowing the number of homes supported by the Scottish Government's funded programmes to absolutely fall off a cliff in the last couple of years. There is simply no route to net zero without an ambitious programme to get Scotland off fossil fuels. And if we didn't understand the wider benefits of doing that before, the current spike in oil and gas prices caused by yet another illegal war should make it abundantly clear. Many people talk about the excuses, talk about a high electricity price as an excuse. High electricity price is a political choice, and it's one that would be made much worse with the wildly expensive option of nuclear energy. Renewable electricity is the cheapest to generate, and it's only the increasingly perverse UK regulation of energy prices that fails to pass on that low price to bill payers. Those who are concerned about the cost rarely acknowledge the cost of inaction. In the last weeks, we've finally seen the UK Government's national security assessment of ecosystem collapse and biodiversity loss. And never mind the long-term catastrophic risks, even in the short term, it shows that it could cost 12% of GDP as soon as 2030. And now, even as the previous partial consensus has broken down, because although most of the public still want climate action, the parties on the right have given up on any credible climate policy altogether and talk of repealing the legislation and spent half their time in this debate demanding more fossil fuels, something supported even by some in the SNP who are apparently unaware that the approval of Rosebank was already thrown out of court because its emissions are dramatically higher than previously acknowledged. The government must significantly strengthen the draft climate plan, and it must be put under consistent pressure in the next session to act with ambition. The political right cannot be trusted to bring that pressure. They will do the opposite. And if the government only feels itself under pressure from those who want to drop climate action and water down policy, they will continue to drift. That's why they must be under pressure from a strong voice in Parliament calling for climate action and showing how it can build us a fairer, more equal and healthier Scotland. And the Scottish Greens will be that voice.
Thank you. I now call Sarah Boyack up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As we close this debate, it's absolutely clear that the climate change plan must contain ambition, but it also needs delivery. And that's something that I got the sense right across our committees, and where we can find agreement across the parties, there is agreement, we need action. I think the fact we're debating it right at the end of this session is a great pity, because a lot of the people who've debated this are moving on. So I think this urgently needs to be a recommendation for the next Parliament to actually debate the final plan and talk about how it can be implemented, because 9 out of our 13 annual targets were missed. So it's not just a failure of targets, it's a warning that we need to do better. And lessons need to be learned, because as 2030 approaches, the window for action is narrowing, and we've got to start moving at speed and take full accountability for missed targets and delayed policies. So the Scottish Government needs to be held to account for delivery. For example, I'm surprised nobody's mentioned this yet. Maybe it's in Douglas Lumsden's final speech. But, it's going to be... won't be from that member then. The draft energy strategy published in January 2023, we're still waiting for it. But last month we got the Just Transition Commission. Their report was titled "No Time to Lose." And that actually tells you we need to be working together, and we need to make the maximum use of the powers that the Scottish Government has. That was a point made by Mark Ruskell. Totally agree with that. A point in the Just Transition Commission report was that we need a place-based approach for every community. So that means communities and local authorities having the capacity and the support to actually deliver in practice. We also need clarity so that sectors can invest, so that businesses can plan, and so that workers can prepare for the future. So the financial aspects of this plan is one of the most concerning gaps. Committees are always told the financial space is very tight, but we need to make sure that there's actual plans in this, incentives to make sure that every policy in here has a fully costed financial plan behind it, and we need to see that in the final plan. We also need better monitoring and evaluation. Climate Change Committee has been absolutely explicit. The final plan must include a complete monitoring and evaluation framework with annual sectoral pathways and indicators of progress, and for this Parliament that needs to be monitored, not just by one committee but a range of committees, because there will never be one committee that is responsible for everything in this climate change plan, and we need everyone involved in that. We also need joined up thinking and action. When we're thinking about electrifying transport, huge opportunities: electrifying rail, electric vehicles, cars and buses. We've also got heat opportunities. We need to think through the local supply chains. We need joined-up action, and that's been referred to in different ways. But one of the things we need to think about is how we use our power better where it's produced. And that's a huge opportunity. It's interesting hearing Paul McLennan's speech. There's a big discussion in the Lothians now about Berwick Bank potentially bringing in lots of new electricity. Why don't we use it where it's produced and use heat networks, both to use that electricity and to use it as a storage process? So we need joined-up thinking. I mentioned solar in my opening comments, and I declare a register of interest. I'm a member of the Edinburgh Solar Co-op, and I've seen the impact it's had on our buildings in Edinburgh owned by the council, where they haven't had to put any investment in because that was done by the Solar Co-op, and it has made money. We should be doing that everywhere, but locally. I also used to work with the SFHA, again register of interest. I saw the benefits of solar heat and solar power. We always talk about solar power, but actually the tech can be used to heat your water in your home. And we need a joined-up approach. I think there's a lot we've done with new housing. There was a reference by Patrick Harvey at the first Climate Act. I sneaked an amendment in with negotiation with the Deputy First Minister that all new homes had to have some form of renewables. That has happened. And there was work constructively with the building sector. A lot of it's solar, but not exclusively. But what we're not seeing is the work to decarbonise existing homes and buildings. And the points made by Kevin Stewart, I think Bob Doris, tenements are absolutely critical. So for the next Parliament, we don't just need a nice to have on tenements. We need to think about how you improve the quality of tenements and look at the opportunities to have affordable heating that will actually mean people can afford to have their heating on. Because we didn't talk about this, but there are social justice issues about heating and there are health issues. You need to have your home at least 19 degrees if you're an older person. And if you've got a person who's got a disability, they urgently need that to be addressed. So there's lots of work that can be done. And I talk about the local issue. Think of the local jobs and supply chains if we have a programme and a plan to heat our homes effectively and affordably. And I know we've got the warm home plans in the UK. Let's learn from that. I think, am I now winding up? So I'll get to the very end. I think we need to make this an opportunity. We need joined up thinking across government, and we need to make sure that in the next session, this is not just a job for one of the cabinet members. This is a job for every single member of the government, because if we don't do that, we have a climate emergency that will impact on Scotland, massive missed opportunities and social challenges. So let's get on with it, and let's have a proper discussion early doors. I hope the Cabinet Secretary has been listening, not just today, but for the last however many weeks and months, because there are big opportunities here and we need to seize them together. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Sue Webber up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And this debate has exposed a bit of a fundamental divide in the Parliament. On one side sits the left-wing Holyrood consensus, determined to push ahead with arbitrary 2045 net zero targets, regardless of the cost to families, businesses and to Scotland's vital oil and gas sector. And on the other side stands, or sits, most of the Scottish Conservatives, who are clear that climate action must be credible, affordable and deliverable. So let's start with the facts. The Scottish Government's own independent advisers, the Climate Change Committee, have been explicit about what meeting the 2045 target entails. By 2030, 35,000 heat pumps have to be installed every single year. By 2035, 60% of cars and vans have to be electric. There needs to be a reduction of 2 million cattle and sheep, a fifth cut in meat consumption, I think I might have a ribeye tonight, and nearly tenfold increase in land used for woodland. These are not marginal adjustments. These are profound changes to how people heat their homes, travel to work, run their farms and feed their families. Yet the Government refuses to level with the public about what the scale and disruption involved or the bill that will come with it. The estimates the net cost of reaching net zero at £750 million per year between 2025 and 2050, with costs peaking before benefits are realised. And the Government's own draft climate change plan admits that the Scottish economy will be £6.1 billion worse off by 2030 and £4.8 billion down by 2040, even after projected savings. These are massive numbers. Businesses alone face £8.5 billion in costs by 2040. Who's going to pay? When asked, ministers... I will, Cabinet
Secretary, briefly.
Would Sue Webber not agree then with the Office of Budget Responsibility report that estimates that unchecked climate change can cost up to 8% of UK GDP if we do nothing?
Sue Webber.
I really don't think that consumers at home care much about 8% of GDP when they are facing absolutely crippling bills to their household incomes. But Minister, you've still not answered the question I asked. It's like, who will pay? Yeah. Who will pay? Officials have admitted they can't predict where the burden will fall on taxpayers, households or industry. That's not a plan. You're gambling with other people's money. And even Audit Scotland has warned that the costs lack transparency, and there's no clear breakdown of who pays, when they pay or how the investment will be funded. The Parliament has been asked to sign off a strategy without knowing the price tag, and we've all seen this before. The Government's previous 2030 target to cut emissions by 70% was abandoned after it became clear it was not credible. And now we've been told to have confidence again. Confidence in what? Confidence in a plan published late, confidence in proposals that are not fully costed, confidence in a strategy that places almost twice the reliance on negative emissions technologies as the CCC's balanced pathway, technologies that even the committee has described as largely untested at scale and a significant delivery risk. Confidence in electric vehicle uptake doing the heavy lifting, despite serious concerns about affordability that we've heard, charging infrastructure and grid capacity, things I can all testify as being real. It's all wishful thinking. And meanwhile, the human cost of this approach is already being felt. Scotland has lost 3 oil and gas jobs for every 1 clean job created over the past decade, and more than 13,000 jobs have disappeared in a single year. I'm looking to see who's that. Mr Doris, yes, I will.
Very briefly, Bob Doris.
Just listening intently to the members, could the member tell me something that they like about the plan, please?
Sue Webber.
Well, we'll see if I'll come to that, Mr Doris, in the short 2 minutes that I have left. I'll leave you eagerly anticipating from your sedentary position, but that's fine. Thanks for asking. Communities in the North East are being hollowed out while ministers talk about a just transition. And the industry body Offshore Energies UK has been clear. Oil and gas still has a vital role to play alongside renewables in delivering energy security and net zero. Instead of backing the sector, the government has presided over industrial decline. But let me be clear, the Scottish Conservatives, despite what you might have heard from me, Mr Doris, listen to this bit, we do believe in protecting our environment, and Mr Kerr did say that earlier. We support a transition to cleaner energy, and we recognise the need to reduce emissions, not just from politicians. But we will not sign up to targets that can't be delivered without hammering households and sacrificing jobs. And we will not endorse a plan that puts billions of pounds of costs into businesses while offering little clarity and less honesty. I won't miss the Alba, thank you very much. Scotland's emissions are already down 50% from the 1990 baseline, and progress has been made. The Scottish Conservatives would scrap the arbitrary 2045 target, and we would replace it with a credible, affordable pathway, one that protects oil and gas jobs, safeguards energy security and supports technological innovation and keeps bills as low as possible for consumers. We want to focus on a delivery and a transition that carries the public with it, rather than imposing severe lifestyle restrictions without consent. Presiding Officer, if climate policy loses public support, it will fail. If it undermines our economy, it will backfire. And if it's built on shaky assumptions and opaque costings, it will certainly not endure. The Scottish Conservatives choose practical progress. We will stand up for Scottish workers, we will stand up for Scottish businesses, and we will stand up for a climate policy that is honest, affordable and fair.
Thank you. I now call on Gillian Martin. Up to 7 minutes, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you. I think it's been largely, with some exceptions, been a very constructive debate, and I think there's been some very good contributions. I'm always very aware of, I want to pick out where people have been constructive, and if I can be allowed to, this might be the last opportunity to have a climate change debate in which Sarah Boyack is taking part in, and I just want to wish Sarah Boyack all the best for what comes next, and say how much I've enjoyed working with her on this. We disagree on a few things, maybe on the methods of how we do things, but I think we both feel quite similarly about our portfolios and the importance of them. And I want to say, when Sarah Boyack mentioned about heat networks, I think that is going to be a big project for the next Parliament as well, and I think we've got all the opportunities. I've been trying to discuss with her colleagues down in London about the issues of constrained payments and maybe taking constrained payments away and incentivising private wire to heat networks. I think we'll watch this space. Also, I mean, Mark Ruskell, obviously critical, but always with solutions and suggestions, which I very much appreciate. And I want to also mention Paul McLennan's very considered contribution around it, and mention that climate hubs are actually critical in getting buy-in from communities, and I appreciate the work they do. And indeed, the correspondence and time I spent with them in talking about the climate change plan as well. I do want to also make a special mention of Bob Doris's contribution, because I think that, well, first of all, he was one of the few that mentioned peatlands and the importance of woodland creation and peatlands, and how that methodology is changing, and how some of the assumptions that were made before are changing as well, and how the climate change plan has to be an agile and adaptive plan as technology and methodology improves, and indeed things happen in a global context as well. But I will go to some of the recommendations from the committees, because after all this is a committee debate. Health committees called for more of the health benefits of climate action to be visible in the final plan. This is music to my ears. I remember making that point when I was the convener of the Environment Climate Change Committee in the last term of Parliament to the then convener of the Health Committee, who challenged me and said, well, that's my job. No, it's not. It's all our jobs. And I think that's been made clear by quite a lot of contributors today, is that this is not just a whole government approach and a whole portfolio approach, as it is. You know, I'm sitting here with the Cabinet Secretary for the area that is doing most of the work in this climate change plan in terms of transport, but it also cuts across housing, it cuts across land use, it cuts across health, and indeed it cuts across economy as well. So absolutely, we have worked with Edinburgh Climate Change Institute to describe and quantify the health benefits and the co-benefits much better. Rural Islands Committee called for greater monitoring and evaluation, as quite a few committees did. Understanding our progress in delivering the climate change plan is a priority for me, and much of this work is already underway, and indeed Mary Goujon is working on the agricultural reform programme. Of course, she's another person who won't be here in the next term, and I will be should I retain this position, I will be speaking to her successor about this critical work. They've also called for regional land use partnerships, placing a firmer footing, and we agree on this. We're currently working on a support framework for partnerships to help our communities, including farmers, crofters, land managers, to agree and deliver their priorities for land use, including tree planting and peatland restoration. The Net Zero Committee has asked us to work closely with the UK Government on reserved areas like vehicle licensing, public EV charging and indeed electricity market reform. We have been and we will continue to do so. They have also asked for the plan to signal investment opportunities to the private sector. This is a priority not just for me but for other Cabinet Secretaries as well. Indeed, the Deputy First Minister has been doing a great deal of work on this and making sure that the investment portal that's out there also looks at climate opportunities. Do I have any time, Presiding Officer?
There's not really an awful lot.
Okay, I'll keep going. Sorry, Convener. They asked for more effective links from the plan to other government actions, including the Scottish Budget. I agree. The Scottish Budget provided record funding for over £5 billion for activities to support our climate goals, and indeed we have the climate taxonomy associated with the budget as well, and indeed the budget included new climate initiatives such as the levy on private jet use in Scotland and other. Clearly, there are many points of agreement that will strengthen the delivery of the plan. Presiding Officer, it brings me back to why we're here. I'm crystal clear that the draft climate change plan must both deliver a pathway for the Scottish Government to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, but not just the Scottish Government, for Scotland to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions in a fair and just way that delivers on our aspirations to improve the well-being and economic opportunities for the people of Scotland in a just and fair way. When I met with community leaders from our Climate Action Hub network in January, they were clear that maintaining the support for climate action, we must proudly describe the benefits that they offer. And I would say that the majority of people in this chamber did describe those benefits, but I will rail against those who want to weaponise negative approaches to the need for climate action, and that includes people who have negative scaremongering around renewables. What people want is us to work together to come up with solutions that will make our lives better and get behind action that will create jobs, make our environment better and making our households and communities more resilient. What they don't like is hysterics, ideas bereft, personal attacking and shouting. People do not like that. It achieves nothing. Douglas Lumsden did that to me today, as he does every time in this chamber. And when you take a newspaper headline and you twist it into a personal attack, which is untrue, I want to just clarify on the record, when I talked about those who weaponise anti-renewables rhetoric, I was talking about reform, but I was also talking about those who ape reform. I was talking about people like Douglas Lumsden. People want us to work together. This is far too important for personal attacks. Presiding Officer.
Of order, Douglas Lumsden.
Sorry, I'm just for asking for your clarification. At the end of the Cabinet Secretary's contribution, she seemed to call me somebody from the far right. Would you maybe clarify whether that's acceptable language that the Cabinet Secretary should be using against another Member of Parliament?
Thank you. The member knows that I am very, very keen that all members treat each other with courtesy and respect at all times, but I will intervene where I feel that is required. Cabinet Secretary.
I have concluded. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call on Michael Matheson on behalf of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee to wind up the debate.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I begin by apologising for being slightly late for the start of the debate. I will seek to try and draw the debate together in a consensual fashion, given the importance of this particular issue. I want to also put on record my thanks to all of those members who have contributed to this afternoon's debate, and in particular the committees who have taken time to scrutinise the draft climate change plan. I think in reflection it feels as though the wider committee engagement on this particular plan has been greater on this occasion than we've experienced in previous occasions, and that's to be very much welcomed, because ownership of the draft climate change plan and the final plan is absolutely critical to its success. Not just ownership in government, and I will come to that point, ownership in Parliament as well. Ownership on the basis that to tackle the issues that we need to within our healthcare system, whether it be through the green theatres or through pharmacology and all of the other measures that can be taken through energy efficiency in our health service, it is important that in the next session of Parliament that the Health Committee are alive to these issues and pursue these issues with vigour. The same for the Local Government Committee for Rural Affairs, whether it also be for the Committee on Constitution and Culture. It will be essential that there is a collective responsibility in Parliament in pursuing and considering the draft climate change plan. And I think it would be fair to say that there are broadly 3 buckets of evidence that we received as a committee in considering the evidence around the plan. One bucket was that of those who think it may go too far in some areas, that they think it's just too ambitious in what it's trying to achieve in some areas. I know that some, by the look in their face, may feel as though there weren't many of those, but I'm afraid, Mr Harvey, there were. There are those who feel it hasn't gone far enough as well, and are those who think it reaches the right point at this particular juncture as well. Wherever you are on this particular journey, wherever you think and whether it goes too far, not far enough, or it's about right, the issue, though, is, and it's clear from the debate this afternoon, is the issue of delivery. And a lot of the recommendations that have come from the committee focus on the importance of delivery. Any plan and its ownership is only as good as how it will be implemented and how it will be delivered. And the committee have highlighted a number of concerns around the issue of delivery and the shortage of detail provided within the draft plan on how key aspects will be delivered, whether that be in aspects around agriculture and the way in which Mr Carson raised and the importance of both policy and finance measures in helping to support the sector and how that can support its transition, whether it be in heat and buildings, or whether it be in local government support, or whether it be through our healthcare system. The policy of delivery will be absolutely critical in all of these areas. And I suspect part of the challenge here for the Cabinet Secretary is that a number of key parts of delivering in these areas don't all rest with the Cabinet Secretary for Climate Change. They don't all rest with the Cabinet Secretary for Transport. They rest with the Health Secretary, with the Housing Secretary and others, which is why it will be important in focusing on delivery across these portfolios and ensuring that there is proper structure within government in order to identify how that delivery is being taken forward. And there is a very clear line of responsibility and a clear line of action that is going to be taken forward in those individual portfolios in which to do so. Which then brings me on to another important recommendation which the committee made, and that is, as has been mentioned by a number of members in the debate this afternoon, the issue of early warning indicators and a means by which they can also be visible to the public and to Parliament. So the idea of having early warning indicators isn't just a case of doing it for the sake of it. Because if we reach a point, having moved from an annual target-based system to a 5-yearly carbon budget over the course of the next decade and a half, if we start to lose momentum in key areas, we need to identify that at an early stage.
Because the danger is that the burden then falls on other policy areas who have to then make up the gap. And we know that from our experience previously, that is very difficult to achieve and in effect doesn't work effectively. Which is why having a system that allows us to have early warning indicators not only helps to support government in developing its policy and in making sure policy is on track or identifying where there are early challenges, but also it can aid and support parliamentarians and committees in being able to scrutinise how government is going about dealing with some of these issues. And I hope that in the final iteration of this report and how the government seeks to take it forward, it will recognise the importance of having that transparency, that accountability that you get through an early warning indicator system in order to identify these gaps as and when they arise. Which brings me on to a further point around some of the specific policy areas. If we look at, for example, the way in which the report seeks to address issues around energy, there is a very significant reliance on decarbonisation through electrification of our society, whether it be at a domestic or at an industrial level. Sitting alongside that, also a greater dependency on negative emission technologies, some of which we know are still in their infancy and still carry significant risk. Therefore, there is a need to make sure that we also build in sufficient contingency in how we plan for these areas should they not be able to lift the level of commitment that the plan is expecting. Now, I have reflected on some of the debate we've had here this afternoon around what at times felt as though it wasn't a committee report on a draft climate change plan, that it was actually a committee report on an energy strategy, but it was very much about needing to make sure that we are looking at where we are dealing with new technology, there is a risk that it will not be able to meet the level of ambition that we are looking for, and therefore we need to ensure there is sufficient contingency in the system in order to do and deal with that. I'm happy to give way to Sarah Boyack.
Sarah Boyack.
I think there's a risk of not applying new technologies as well. And if you were to take the issue of sustainable aviation fuel, our planes are going to be using it very soon and going forward, or the opportunities with green hydrogen. There are real opportunities there, but also risks if we don't actually get the joined-up support to actually deliver.
Michael Matheson.
I very much agree. It's not a case of not deploying new technologies. It's recognising that some of them carry different levels of risk, and we need to be mindful of that. And we also need to make sure that the plan is drafted in such a way that it actually has some contingency in it in order to address these issues. But it also feeds into the importance of actually having the early warning indicators, so when things are going off track, that you can take early action in order to address these issues. I want to touch on a couple of points. Presiding Officer, I'm not sure how I'm doing time-wise for you at this stage.
You have another minute.
Another minute. I'll just briefly touch on a couple of areas then. One is in the area of transport. We've heard several members raising the issue around electrification and some of the challenges which we face in that. Significant progress has been made, but particularly in the HGV sector, there is a significant challenge there that needs to be addressed. In closing my remarks, I want to emphasise the committee's point that this is an opportunity to reset Scotland's net zero ambitions. The draft plan sets ambitions across sectors, but the evidence heard by the committee also identifies some key areas of risk. These include the switch over, as I've mentioned, to electrical vehicles, the decarbonisation of our homes, the decarbonisation of freight transport, and the use of negative emission technologies, as well as the importance of making sure we deliver on woodland creation and peatland restoration targets. These are the areas that have significant emission reductions associated with them in terms of tonnage, but we and the committee have highlighted challenges that will need to be overcome if we are to deliver on these ambitions. And I very much hope that the Scottish Government will consider what has been set out in our report and the other committee's report and work to address these at pace as they look to finalise their plan.
Thank you. That concludes the debate on the draft climate change plan on behalf of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee. It's now time to move on to the next item of business, which is consideration of motion 20981 in the name of Gillian Martin on the appointment of board member to Environmental Standards Scotland. And I call on Gillian Martin to move the motion.
Moved.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. The question on this motion will be put at decision time. The next item of business is consideration of motion 20935 in the name of Shona Robertson on a financial resolution for the Freedom of Information Reform Scotland Bill. And I call on the Cabinet Secretary, Shona Robertson, to move the motion.
Moved.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. The question on this motion will be put at decision time, and there are 4 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first is that motion 20944 in the name of Richard Lockhead on the Digital Assets Scotland Bill at stage 3 be agreed. And as this is a motion to pass the bill, the question must be decided by division, and there will be a short suspension to allow members to access the digital voting system.